A storm rages over Enderby Hall, where the Abernethy family mourns their patriarch, Richard dead, they say, of a failing heart. But was it murder? A woman's voice, sharp. He was murdered, wasn't he? Hercule Poirot steps into a web of greed, secrets, and lies. Who among the heirs gamblers, actors, schemers, hid a killer's heart? What did Richard know that sealed his fate? And why is eccentric Cora, who dared speak the truth, now in mortal danger? Chapter 1. The funeral's chilling echo. The rain fell in relentless sheets, drumming against the leaded windows of Enderby Hall, like the impatient fingers of some spectral mourner. The ancient manor, crouched amid the rolling hills of Berkshire, seemed to shudder under the storm's assault, its ivy-clad walls glistening darkly in the fading November light. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of beeswax, polish, and the faint, cloying musk of chrysanthemums, arranged in sombre bouquets around the drawing-room, where the Abernethy family had gathered to bid farewell to their patriarch, Richard Abernethy. Hercule Poirot stood at the threshold of the room, his small, fastidious figure framed by the carved oak doorway. His patent leather shoes gleamed, a defiant spark of order against the gloom, and his moustache waxed to perfection, curled with a precision that belied the chaos he sensed within. He had arrived at Enderby only hours ago, summoned by Mr. Gilbert, Entwistle, the family solicitor, who had hinted at irregularities surrounding Richard's death. Poirot's grey eyes, sharp as cut glass, swept over the assembled mourners, cataloguing their postures, their glances, their silences. The little grey cells, he thought. They are already at work. The funeral had concluded that morning at St. Mary's Church, a dour affair under a sky that wept as if in sympathy. Richard Abernethy, a titan of industry who had built a fortune in shipping and textiles, had died 10 days prior at the age of 72. His death, attributed to a heart condition, had been sudden but not entirely unexpected. Yet Entwistle's urgent telegram had suggested otherwise, and Poirot's curiosity, his besoin for truth, had compelled him to accept the invitation. Now, as the family awaited the reading of the will, the drawing-room buzzed with attention that Poirot found almost palpable. The fire in the massive stone hearth crackled, casting flickering shadows across the faces of the heirs. They sat in a loose semicircle, their chairs drawn close as if to ward off the chill that seeped through the walls. Poirot noted their positions with care, a map of alliances and animosities. At the center was Timothy Abernethy, Richard's younger brother, a man of 58, whose pallor and trembling hands suggested either genuine illness or a flair for the dramatic. He clutched a tartan blanket over his knees, though the room was warm, and his eyes darted restlessly. Beside him sat Maud, his wife, a broad-shouldered woman with a face as unyielding as the granite cliffs of her native Cornwall. Her hands, folded in her lap, were still, but Poirot observed the faint whitening of her knuckles, a sign of suppressed emotion. To Timothy's left was George Crossfield, a cousin of Richard's, whose slicked-back hair and tailored suit could not disguise the nervous tick at the corner of his mouth. George, Poirot recalled from Entwistle's briefing, was a stockbroker with a penchant for risky ventures and an equally risky fondness for the roulette table. His fingers toyed with a silver cigarette case, snapping it open and shut with a rhythm that grated on the nerves. Across from George sat Michael and Rosamond Shane, a married couple whose theatrical careers had lent them an air of calculated charm. Michael, darkly handsome, lounged with a studied ease, one arm draped over the back of his chair. Rosamond, blonde and luminous, leaned forward, her green eyes catching the firelight as she murmured something to her husband. Their whispers, Poirot noted, drew a scowl from Susan Banks, the final heir, who sat apart, her dark hair pulled into a severe bun. Susan, Richard's niece, had a scientist's precision in her movements, and her gaze was steady, almost defiant, as if daring the room to underestimate her. At the edge of the group stood Cora Lansquenet, Richard's younger sister, a woman whose flamboyant attire, peacock blue shawl, and a hat adorned with ostrich feathers, clashed with the room's somber mood. Cora's face, lined with years of unconventional living, bore a mischievous smile, and her eyes flitted from one heir to another, as if savoring a private joke. Poirot found her intriguing. She was, he sensed, a disruptor, a catalyst. Mr. Entwistle, a wiry man with spectacles perched on a beak-like nose, cleared his throat and stepped to the center of the room. He held a sealed envelope, its edges yellowed, and a leather-bound ledger. The family's murmurs ceased, replaced by a silence so thick it seemed to absorb the crackle of the fire. "Ladies and gentlemen," Entwistle began, his voice thin but steady, "we are gathered to honor Richard Abernethy's final wishes. As his solicitor, I have the duty to read his will, executed 6 months ago in my presence. Before we proceed, I must note that Mr. Hercule Poirot, at my request, is here as an observer. His expertise may prove valuable in the days ahead." A ripple of unease passed through the room. Timothy's blanket slipped slightly, and he muttered something inaudible. George's cigarette case snapped shut with a finality that made Rosamond flinch. Susan's eyes narrowed, fixing on Poirot, who inclined his head in acknowledgment. Cora, however, let out a delighted cackle. "Oh, a detective!" she exclaimed, clapping her hands. "How perfectly thrilling! Are we to be suspects in some grand mystery, then?" "Cora, please," Maud said, her voice low and sharp. "This is hardly the time for theatrics." "But isn't it always the time?" Cora replied, undeterred. "Richard's gone, and here we are, squabbling over his gold-like vultures. I say, let's have a bit of fun with it." Poirot's moustache twitched. Cora's levity was a mask, he suspected, concealing a sharper mind. He made a mental note to speak with her privately. Entwistle, ignoring the interruption, broke the seal on the envelope and began to read. Richard's will was methodical, reflecting the man's orderly nature. The bulk of his estate, bet nearly £2 million, was to be divided equally among Timothy, George, Susan, Rosamond, Michael, and Cora, with provisions for Maud, should Timothy predecease her. Smaller bequests went to the household staff, including Lanscombe, the butler, and a local charity. Enderby Hall itself was to remain in trust, maintained for the family's use. As Entwistle droned on, Poirot watched the heirs' reactions. Timothy's shoulders relaxed slightly, as if a weight had lifted. George exhaled, his tic subsiding. Rosamond's fingers tightened on Michael's arm, and Susan's lips pressed into a thin line. Cora, however, seemed distracted, her gaze fixed on a portrait of Richard above the fireplace's stern. Grey-haired man whose eyes seemed to follow the room. When Entwistle finished, he folded the document and adjusted his spectacles. "Any questions?" he asked. The room was silent, but the air crackled with unspoken thoughts. Poirot, sensing the moment's fragility, stepped forward, his voice soft but commanding. "Monsieur Entwistle, if I may," he said, raising a hand. "It is clear that Monsieur Abernethy was a man of great foresight, but I am curious, did he ever express concerns about his health, or perhaps about those around him?" Entwistle hesitated, glancing at the family. "Richard was private about such matters," he said carefully. "He trusted his doctor, Dr. Larrabee, and seemed content with his arrangements." "Content," Cora interjected, her voice slicing through the room like a blade. "Oh, that's rich. Richard wasn't content at all. He was worried, sick literally, Cora," Timothy snapped, his voice shrill. "What are you blathering about?" Cora rose, her shawl slipping to reveal a string of amber beads that gleamed like embers. She pointed a trembling finger at the portrait. "Don't play the fool, Timothy. You all know it's been hushed up nicely, hasn't it? But he was murdered, wasn't he?" The word murdered landed like a thunderclap. Maud gasped, her hand flying to her chest. George's cigarette case fell to the floor with a clatter. Michael leaned forward, his actor's face a mask of shock, while Rosamond's eyes widened, her breath catching. Susan alone remained still, her gaze locked on Cora, as if measuring her words. "Cora, that's outrageous," Entwistle sputtered. "There's no evidence. No evidence." Cora laughed, a brittle sound. "Richard was fit as a fiddle until those last weeks. Then, suddenly, his heart gives out. And now we're all here, counting his money like it's our due. Someone wanted him gone, and I'll bet my share there in this room." Poirot's heart quickened. Cora's accusation, reckless as it was, had shattered the room's fragile decorum. He studied the heirs, noting their reactions. Timothy's face was flushed, his hands gripping the blanket. Maud's eyes darted to her husband, a flicker of fear in them. George retrieved his cigarette case, his fingers trembling. Michael's shock had given way to a calculating frown, and Rosamond's hand now clutched a pearl necklace, twisting it tightly. Susan's expression was unreadable, but her fingers tapped a slow rhythm on her armrest. "Madame Lansquenet," Poirot said, his tone soothing yet firm. "This is a grave claim. Have you proof, or is it merely a feeling?" Cora turned to him, her eyes blazing. "Proof. Not yet, Monsieur Poirot. But I've got eyes, and I've got ears. Richard told me things. He wouldn't tell this lot. He didn't trust them, not one bit. Enough, Timothy roared, slamming a fist on his chair. You're mad, Cora, always stirring trouble, just like when we were children. Richard died of a heart attack, and that's the end of it. Is it? Cora shot back. Then why did he call me the night before he died, sounding scared out of his wits? He said someone was watching him, someone close. The room fell silent, the only sound the rain's relentless patter and the fire's dying crackle. Poirot's mind raced. Cora's words, if true, suggested a conspiracy. If false, they were a dangerous provocation. Either way, she had painted target on herself. Entwistle, regaining his composure, stepped forward. This is highly irregular, he said. Cora, if you have concerns, they should be addressed privately with the authorities or with Monsieur Poirot. For now, I suggest we adjourn. Dinner will be served at 7. The family dispersed, their movements stiff, their glances wary. Timothy wheeled himself toward the hall moored at his side. George lit a cigarette, the flame trembling in his hand. Michael and Rosamond exchanged a look before following. Susan lingered, watching Cora, who remained by the fireplace, her expression defiant. Poirot approached Entwistle, who was gathering his papers. "Monsieur," he said quietly, "this accusation of Madame Lansquenet, it troubles you?" Nan. Entwistle sighed, removing his spectacles. "Cora's always been fanciful," he said. "But Richard did mention feeling uneasy in his last weeks. I thought it was his illness talking. Now, I'm not so sure." Poirot nodded, his mind already forming a plan. "I will dine with the family tonight," he said, "and I will observe. The truth, it hides in the smallest details." As Entwistle left, Poirot turned to the room, now empty save for Cora, who stood before Richard's portrait. She traced a finger along the frame, her smile gone. "You knew, didn't you?" she murmured, as if speaking to the painting. "You knew they'd come for you." Poirot stepped closer, his voice gentle. "Madame, a word of caution. If what you say is true, you have made enemies today. Be vigilant." Cora met his gaze, her eyes fierce. "I'm not afraid, Monsieur Poirot. I've lived too long to care what they think. But mark my words, someone in this house has blood on their hands." She swept past him, her shawl trailing like a comet's tail, leaving Poirot alone in the drawing-room. The fire had dwindled to embers, and the rain had softened to a mournful drizzle. He approached the portrait, studying Richard's painted eyes. "What did you see, mon ami?" he wondered, "and who saw you?" Dinner that evening was a strained affair, served in Enderby's cavernous dining-hall. The table, set with silver and crystal, gleamed under a chandelier that cast jagged shadows on the panelled walls. Lanscombe, the butler, moved silently, his lined face impassive as he poured wine and served roast pheasant. Poirot, seated between Susan and Entwistle, noted the butler's economy of movement, the way his eyes avoided the heirs. The conversation was stilted, punctuated by the clink of cutlery and the occasional cough. Timothy, at the head of the table, complained of a draught, though the windows were shut. Maud cut his food with a precision that bordered on aggression. George, 3 glasses of wine deep, attempted a jest about the stock market, but it fell flat. Michael and Rosamond, seated together, spoke in low tones, their laughter forced. Susan, to Poirot's right, ate sparingly, her eyes flicking to Cora, who sat at the table's far end, picking at her plate with a distracted air. Poirot, ever the conversationalist, attempted to lighten the mood. "Madame Shane," he said, addressing Rosamond, "I understand you are an actress. Have you performed in London recently?" Rosamond's smile was radiant but brittle. "Oh yes, Monsieur Poirot. A small production of Hedda Gabler last spring. It was, well, let's say the critics were unkind." "Critics," Michael said, his voice smooth, "are parasites who've never created a thing in their lives." Rosamond was magnificent. Poirot inclined his head. "I have no doubt. And you, Monsieur Shane, your career also thrives." Michael's smile tightened. "It's a fickle business, but we manage. Richard was kind enough to support our endeavors." "Support," Cora said suddenly, her voice cutting through the room. "That's a polite way of saying he bailed you out of debt, isn't it?" Michael's fork paused midair. Rosamond's cheeks flushed. The table fell silent, all eyes on Cora. "Cora, that's uncalled for," Susan said, her tone measured. "But firm, is it?" Cora replied, leaning forward. "Let's not pretend we're all saints. Richard's money kept half this table afloat. George's gambling, Timothy's endless doctors, your little theatre dreams." She gestured at Michael and Rosamond. "And now he's gone, and we're all wondering who gets what. Funny how death sharpens the appetite." Timothy slammed, pour his glass down, wine sloshing onto the tablecloth. "You're disgusting, Cora. Always poking, always prodding. If you've got something to say, spit it out." Cora's eyes gleamed. "Oh, I've said it, Timothy. Murder, that's the word. You're all afraid of, and I'll say it again until someone listens." Poirot watched the exchange, his mind cataloguing every reaction. Timothy's anger seemed genuine, but there was a tremor in his voice, a hint of fear. Maud's hand rested on her husband's arm, restraining him. George's tic had returned, his fingers drumming on the table. Michael's jaw clenched, and Rosamond's eyes darted to her husband, as if gauging his response. Susan's face was a mask, but her fingers had stilled. "Mademoiselle Lansquenet," Poirot said, his voice calm, "you speak with passion. But passion without proof is like a fire without fuel. Without fuel it burns brightly, then fades. If you have evidence, share it, and I will listen." Cora opened her mouth, then hesitated, her bravado faltering. I don't have it yet," she admitted, "but I will. Richard deserves that much." The tension lingered, unbroken, until Lanscombe entered with dessert a lemon tart, whose sharpness seemed to mirror the mood. As the meal concluded, the family retired to their rooms, their footsteps echoing in the vast hall. Poirot remained, sipping a tisane Entwistle had offered, his mind worried. Madame Lansquenet is either very brave or very foolish, he said to Entwistle, who lingered by the fire. Or both, Entwistle replied. Cora's always been a loose cannon. But if she's right, he trailed off, his face troubled. If she is right, Poirot said, then this house holds a secret that will not stay buried. And I, Hercule Poirot, will uncover it. As he spoke, his eyes drifted to the dining hall's far corner, where Lanscombe stood clearing the table. The butler's movements were slow, deliberate, but Poirot caught a fleeting glance, a look of unease, directed not at him, but at the empty chair where Cora had sat. It was a glance that spoke of knowledge, of fear, of something hidden. Poirot's moustache twitched, a sign of satisfaction. The first thread, he thought, and it is already unraveling. The rain had ceased, leaving a silence that pressed against Enderby's walls. In the distance, a clock struck 9, its chimes mournful, like a dirge. Poirot rose, his tisane finished, and made his way to his room, his mind alive with possibilities. The funeral was over, but the mystery had only begun, and somewhere in the shadows of Enderby Hall, a killer watched, waiting. Chapter 2. Cora's last canvas the morning after Richard Abernethy's funeral broke over Enderby Hall with a sullen, bruised sky, the kind that promised rain but held it back like a grudge. Hercule Poirot, impeccably dressed despite the hour, stood at the window of his guest-room, his small hands clasped behind his back. The Gothic spires of the manor loomed through the mist, their edges softened like a watercolor left too long in the damp. Below, the gravel drive was churned from yesterday's carriages, the mourners' comings and goings, now a faint echo in the quiet Mon Ami. Poirot murmured to himself, his moustache twitching. The stage is set, but the players, they are not yet honest. Cora Lansquenet's words at the will reading still rang in his ears. It's been hushed up nicely, hasn't it? But he was murdered, wasn't he? The accusation had sliced through the room like a blade, leaving the Abernethy heirs frozen, their faces a gallery of shock, guilt, or calculation. Poirot had watched them all, Timothy's pallor, Rosamond's flicker of a smile, George's restless fingers, and, now summoned by the family solicitor, Mr. Entwistle, he was here to unravel the truth. A sharp knock interrupted his thoughts. Entwistle, his face drawn and grey as the morning, stood at the door. "Poirot, there's been a development," he said, his voice low. "It's Cora. She's dead." Poirot's eyes narrowed, the only sign of surprise. Dead? How? Murdered? At her cottage in Lightship St. Mary. A neighbour found her this morning, struck down with a hatchet. The police are there now. Poirot's fingers tapped a silent rhythm on his sleeve. "A hatchet," he repeated softly. "Brutal, yet impulsive, perhaps. We must go at once, Monsieur Entwistle. The scene of a crime speaks loudest when it is fresh." Within the hour, they were in Entwistle's motor-car, rattling along the coastal road toward Lightship St. Mary. The wind whipped off the sea, carrying the tang of salt and the faint cry of gulls. Poirot sat in silence, his eyes half closed, but his mind churned. Cora's outburst had been a spark in a powder keg. Had it ignited her own destruction? Or was her death a piece of a larger puzzle, one that began with Richard Abernethy's sudden passing. The cottage came into view, a quaint, ivy-clad structure perched on a cliff overlooking the churning channel. Its charm was marred by the cluster, pool, of police officers milling about, their boots trampling the flower beds Cora had tended with such care. A crowd of villagers hovered at the gate, whispering behind their hands. Poirot stepped from the car, his patent leather shoes sinking slightly to the muddy path, and surveyed the scene with a clinical eye. "Inspector Grange," Entwistle said, introducing a burly man with a face like weathered granite. "This is Hercule Poirot, the detective I mentioned." Grange's eyebrows lifted, but he nodded. "Heard of you, Mr. Poirot. Not sure we need a private sleuth, though. Looks straightforward enough." Someone broke in, grabbed the hatchet from her woodpile, and he made a chopping motion. No sign of theft, mind you, just violence. Poirot tilted his head, his gaze drifting to the cottage's open door. "Straightforward, you say? Yet Madame Lansquenet was no ordinary victim. She spoke of murder yesterday, and today she is silenced. Coincidence, Inspector, is rarely so tidy." Grange grunted, unconvinced, but led them inside. The parlor was a riot of color, every surface cluttered with Cora's paintings, vivid seascapes, portraits, and abstracts that seemed to pulse with her eccentric spirit. But the air was thick with the coppery scent of blood, and Poirot's eyes were drawn to the floor, where Cora lay sprawled beside her easel. Her silver hair was matted with red, her face frozen in a grimace of surprise. The hatchet, still embedded in her skull, gleamed dully in the morning light filtering through the lace curtains. Poirot knelt beside her, careful not to disturb the scene. "She was painting when it happened," he murmured, noting the brush clutched in her stiff fingers, its bristles caked with black paint. The canvas on the easel depicted Enderby Hall, its towers stark against a stormy sky. But in the foreground, at one of the manor's windows, was a shadowy figure, its features indistinct yet menacing. "Monsieur," Poirot breathed. "This is not merely art. This is a confessional, a warning." Entwistle peered over his shoulder, his face pulling. "That figure. Do you think she saw something at Enderby? Something real, or something she feared?" Poirot replied, standing. His gaze swept the room, cataloguing every detail: the overturned chair, the untouched tea tray, the single muddy footprint near the door, its tread sharp and distinct. The killer was careless, leaving such a mark. Yet they did not linger. Why strike and flee? What did they fear? Grange, overhearing, shrugged. "Panic, most like. Amateurs often lose their nerves." Poirot's lips curved faintly. An amateur, perhaps, but one with purpose. This was no random act, Inspector. Cora knew something, and someone wished her silent. He moved to the corner of the room, where a stack of canvases leaned against the wall. Rifling through them, he paused, and won a smaller sketch, tucked behind the others. It was a portrait of Richard Abernethy, his stern face rendered with uncanny precision. But scrawled across his forehead, in Cora's looping hand, was a single question mark. Entwistle gasped. She suspected Richard's death was foul play even before the funeral. "Precisement," Poirot said, holding the sketch to the light. "This is no mere doodle. It is a clue, hidden away, perhaps because she feared for her life. Tell me, Monsieur Entwistle, who knew Cora was returning here after the funeral?" Entwistle frowned, thinking. "The family, of course, and Lansquenet, the butler. I drove her to the station myself, but she mentioned stopping in London briefly to see a gallery. She was always chasing art deals." Poirot nodded, filing the detail away. "And who among the heirs had reason to fear her tongue?" Her accusation at the will reading it was not a secret kept long. Grange, growing impatient, gestured to the door. "We're combing the village for witnesses. Someone must have seen the killer coming or going. You're welcome to poke around, Mr. Poirot, but don't get in our way." Poirot bowed slightly. "I assure you, Inspector, I tread lightly. But I will see what the cottage has to tell me." As Grange and his men dispersed, Poirot began a meticulous exploration of Cora's home. The kitchen was tidy, save for a single teacup in the sink, its rim stained with a faint trace of lipstick not Cora's shade. Poirot noted, for hers was a bold coral, while this was a muted rose. In the bedroom he found her suitcase, a silk scarf trailing from it like a forgotten thought. But it was the studio, a glass-walled annex overlooking the sea, that held his attention longest. The studio was Cora's sanctuary, its walls lined with sketches and half-finished works. A workbench held jars of paint, brushes, and turpentine, all meticulously arranged. But one jar, labeled vermilion, was tipped over, its contents pooling on the wood. Poirot dipped a finger into the spill, sniffing it. "Not vermilion," he murmured. "This is something else." He sealed a sample in a handkerchief, then turned to a small desk cluttered with papers. Among them was a letter, its envelope postmarked London, dated 2 days before Richard's death. The handwriting was unfamiliar, angular, almost aggressive. Poirot slit it open, his eyes scanning the contents. "Cora, you must stop meddling. Richard's affairs are his own. Speak of it to no one, or you'll regret it." A friend. Poirot's mustache twitched. A friend, indeed. A friend who threatens. He tucked the letter into his pocket, his mind racing. The letter suggested Cora had been probing Richard's death before her outburst at the funeral. But who was a friend? An heir? An outsider? And why had Cora kept the letter as if it were a talisman or evidence? Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the studious windows. Poirot stepped onto the cliff path, his coat flapping like a blackbird's wings. The sea churned below, its waves clawing at the rocks. He followed the path to a small shed where Cora kept her gardening tools and her woodpile. The hatchet was gone, of course, but Poirot noticed something else. A faint smear of red paint on the shed's doorframe, matching the vermilion spill in the studio. Double quotes, Curieux, he said aloud. The killer touched this door, perhaps in haste. But why red paint? Was it on their hands, or elsewhere? He returned to the cottage. where Entwistle waited, looking shaken. Poirot, the police found a witness, a fisherman, who saw a motor car parked near the cliff last night, around midnight. A dark sedan, he thinks. No license plate, but it's not a local car. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Midnight, so the killer struck under cover of darkness. And a chauffeur drives one, does he not? As does George, I believe. Entwistle nodded. And Michael and Rosamond borrowed a car from the manor yesterday. Susan, too, has access to her husband's car. It could be any of them, or none, Poirot cautioned. We must not leap to conclusions, mon ami, but we will follow this thread. For now, let us return to Enderby. I wish to speak with the heirs Agonand, to observe their faces when they hear of Cora's death. The drive back was silent, the weight of the morning's discoveries pressing on them both. At Enderby, the family was gathered in the drawing-room, their voices low and strained. Timothy, propped in his wheelchair, was complaining loudly about the damp, while Maud hovered nearby, her face a mask of patience. George stood by the window, his fingers drumming the sill, and Rosamond lounged on a chaise, flipping through a magazine with studied indifference. Susan and her husband, Gregory, sat apart, their heads bent in quiet conversation. Michael paced, his actor's poise fraying at the edges. Entwistle cleared his throat. "I have grave news," he said, his voice trembling. "Cora was found, dead this morning, murdered at her cottage." A stunned silence fell, broken only by Timothy's gasp. "Murdered? Good God, who would?" Rosamond's magazine slipped to the floor, her eyes wide. "A hatchet, you say? That's barbaric." George turned from the window, his face pale. "When did it happen?" "Last night, around midnight. The police believe," Entwistle replied. "A witness saw a car near her cottage." Michael stopped pacing, his hands clenching. "A car? That's for the police to determine," Poirot said, stepping forward. His voice was calm, but his eyes flicked from face to face, noting every reaction. Timothy's shock seemed genuine, but his hands gripped the wheelchair's arms too tightly. Rosamond's surprise felt rehearsed, her lips parting just a fraction. Too late. George's pallor was unmistakable, but was it guilt or fear? Susan's eyes met Poirot's, steady and searching, while Gregory's gaze dropped to the floor. Michael's agitation was raw, but was it grief or panic? "Madame la death is no accident," Poirot continued. "She spoke of murder yesterday, and now she is silenced. Someone feared her words, someone, perhaps, in this room." Maud's voice cut through the tension, sharp and defensive. "That's absurd. Cora was always dramatic. She probably provoked some vagrant." "And Nan," Madame Poirot interrupted, his tone icy. "This was no vagrant. The killer left a footprint, a mark of their presence, and they struck with purpose. I will find them, rest assured." He turned to leave, but paused at the door, his gaze lingering on Rosamond. "Mademoiselle, you visited Cora recently, did you not? To discuss art, perhaps?" Rosamond flushed, her poise cracking. I went to see her paintings. Yes, Plexigal. Why? Poirot smiled faintly. Merely a question, mademoiselle. But the truth, it has a way of surfacing, like a tide. As he and Entwistle retreated to the study, Poirot's mind was a whirl of details. The muddy footprint, the reed paint, the threatening letter, the sketch of Richard with its question mark. Each was a thread in a tapestry of deceit, and he was determined to weave them together. But one question gnawed at him. Why had Cora painted that shadowy figure at Enderby's window? Was it a memory, a fear, or a prophecy? That afternoon, Poirot slipped away to the village post office, where he wired a chemist in London to analyze the vermilion sample. He also sent a telegram to a contact at Scotland Yard, requesting any records of visitors to Leichet St. Mary in the past week. "The net tightens," he murmured, stepping back into the rain dot back at Enderby. He found Susan in the library, poring over a family album. Her face was pale, but her eyes were sharp. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, closing the album, "I think Cora was right. Richard didn't die naturally. He was too careful, too alive." Poirot studied her. "You loved him, mademoiselle." "He was kind to me," she said simply. "Not like the others. They're all chasing his money. But I just wanted his trust. And now Cora's gone, I'm afraid." She hesitated, then leaned closer. "I found something in Richard's study before the funeral, a note in his hand. It said, 'Beware the serpent in the nest.'" Poirot's pulse quickened. "Where is this note?" "I burned it," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought it was just his paranoia. But now I think he meant one of us." Poirot nodded, his mind racing. "Say nothing of this, mademoiselle, but trust Poirot, the serpent. It will not strike again." As night fell over Enderby, Poirot sat in his room, a single lamp casting long shadows. He spread Cora's sketch, the threatening letter, and his tote across the desk, his fingers tracing the question mark on Richard's face. "Cora, ma chère," he whispered, "you have left me a puzzle. But Hercule Poirot, he does not fail." Outside, the wind howled, and somewhere in the manor, a door creaked shut, as if sealing a secret within its walls. Chapter 3. The heirs' hidden motives. The rain had ceased its relentless assault on Enderby Hall, leaving the Gothic manor cloaked in a damp, uneasy silence. The air inside was thick with the scent of old wood and wax polish, the kind of smell that clung to secrets as stubbornly as it did to the heavy drapes. Hercule Poirot, immaculate in his tailored suit and polished shoes, stood in the drawing-room, his sharp eyes scanning the faces of the Abernethy heirs. The will reading had been yesterday, and Cora's shocking accusation that Richard Abernethy, the late patriarch, had been murdered still hung over the family like a storm cloud refusing to dissipate. Now, with Cora herself dead, murdered. In her seaside cottage, the tension in the room was palpable. Each glance between the heirs laced with suspicion, fear, or something darker. Poirot adjusted his moustache, a subtle gesture that masked his intense observation. The heirs were gathered for what Mr. Entwistle, the family solicitor, had tactfully called a discussion of estate matters. In truth, It was Poirot's first opportunity to probe the family's motives, to peel back the polished veneer of grief and uncover the greed or desperation that might have driven one of them to murder. He had requested a private audience with each heir, and now, as they awaited his questions, they sat in a semicircle of unease, their postures betraying more than their words ever could. First was Timothy Abernethy, Richard's younger brother, slumped in a high-backed chair with a tartan blanket draped over his knees. His face, pale and pinched, seemed perpetually contorted in a grimace of discomfort, though Poirot noted the way his eyes darted about, sharp and calculating despite his complaints of illness. Beside him sat Maud, his wife, a sturdy woman with a face like weathered granite, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as if restraining some inner turmoil. George Crossfield, the gambling cousin, lounged with forced nonchalance, his expensive but slightly rumpled suit hinting at late nights and risky bets. Michael and Rosamond Shane, the theatrical couple, sat close together, their polished beauty marred by subtle signs of strain. Michael's jaw tight, Rosamond's fingers nervously twisting a silk scarf. And then there was Susan Banks, the sharp niece, her dark eyes meeting Poirot's with a mix of defiance and curiosity, as if she alone welcomed his scrutiny. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot began, his voice smooth as velvet, yet carrying an edge that commanded attention. "The tragedy of Monsieur Richard Abernethy's death is compounded by the brutal murder of Madame Cora Lansquenet. It is my duty, as requested by Monsieur Entwistle, to ascertain whether these events are connected. To do so, I must understand your lives, your needs, your truths." He paused, letting the word truths linger, his green eyes glinting. "Like polished jade, we shall speak privately, one by one. But first, I observe. And what I observe is a family bound not only by blood but by secrets." A murmur rippled through the room, quickly stifled. Timothy coughed dramatically, clutching, hissed chest. "Be secrets? What nonsense," he wheezed. "I'm a sick man, Monsieur Poirot. I've no energy for secrets, only for surviving this blasted damp." Poirot inclined his head, his expression unreadable. "Bean, Monsieur Timothy, we shall begin with you." Timothy's tale of Woth Library at Enderby Hall was a cavern of oak shelves and faded leather tomes, its air heavy with the musty scent of forgotten stories. Poirot had chosen it for its isolation, far from the prying ears of the puffer heirs. Timothy wheeled himself in, Maud pushing his chair with a stoic efficiency that bordered on mechanical. She hesitated at the door, her broad shoulders stiffening when Poirot politely requested she leave them alone. "I'd rather she stayed," Timothy said, his voice querulous. "I'm not well, you know. My heart, my joints, everything's failing me." Poirot's smile was gentle but unyielding. "Madame Marthe, I assure you, your husband will be safe with Hercule Poirot. A brief conversation, no more." Marthe's lips pressed into a thin line, but she nodded curtly and retreated, closing the door with a soft thud. Timothy's eyes followed. A flicker of something relief, perhaps, or apprehension crossing his face, before he resumed his role as the suffering invalid. "Now, Monsieur Timothy," Poirot said, settling into a chair opposite him, "tell me of your life. Your brother Richard, he was a wealthy man. His fortune, it changes things for you, does it not?" Timothy's mouth twisted, his hands gripping the arms of his wheelchair. "Changes? It's a curse, that's what it is. Richard always lorded his money over us, you know, kept us dangling, promising help but never giving it. I'm a sick man, Monsieur Poirot. Doctors, medicines, treatments, they cost a fortune. Maud does her best, but we've been scraping by for years. Richard could have helped, but he didn't. Now he's gone, and I suppose I'll get my share. But what good is it when I'm half dead already?" Poirot tilted his head, his fingers steepled. "And yet you are here, at Enderby, to claim that share. You were close to your brother, close." Timothy barked a laugh, then winced, clutching his side. "Hardly. He thought me weak. Always did. Said I exaggerated my ailments. Exaggerated. The man had no idea what I suffer. Maud knows, though she's my rock. Without her, I'd be in a sanatorium by now." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly, noting the rehearsed cadence of Timothy's complaints. The way his hands trembled just a touch too dramatically. "And Madame Cora's accusation that Richard was murdered, did this surprise you?" Timothy's face darkened, his fingers tightening on the blanket. Cora was always stirring trouble. Flighty, dramatic woman. I didn't believe her for a second. Murder. Ridiculous. Richard had a bad heart. Everyone knew that. But then he trailed off, his gaze flickering to the window, where the grey light cast long shadows across the room. "Then," Poirot prompted, his voice soft but insistent. Timothy shifted uncomfortably. "Then she was killed, wasn't she? Makes you wonder if she was onto something. But I don't know anything about it, I swear. I was here, in this blasted chair, the whole time." Poirot nodded, his expression serene, but his mind racing. Timothy's performance was convincing, but there was a crack in it, a hint of calculation beneath the complaints. "Mercy, Monsieur Timothy, we shall speak again." As Maud returned to wheel Timothy out, Poirot caught the briefest glance. Between them, a silent communication that spoke louder than words. He made a mental note. Timothy's illness, real or not, was a shield, and Maud was its guardian. George's Gambitha Conservatory, with its glass walls and wilting ferns, was George Crossfield's chosen battleground. He stood by a cracked pane, tossing a coin absently, his boyish charm undercut by the shadows under his eyes. Poirot entered quietly, his footsteps muffled by the mossy tiles, and gestured for George to sit. "No need for formalities, monsieur." "Poirot," George said, flashing a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm an open book. What do you want to know?" Poirot settled onto a wicker chair, his posture impeccable. "An open book, you say? Then let us read the chapter of your finances, Monsieur George. A young man of your appetites. He finds himself in need of funds. Nan, Richard's fortune. It must be a great relief." George's grin faltered, the coin pausing mid-flip. "You don't mince words, do you?" All right, I'll level with you. I like fluttercarts, horses, the odd casino. Haven't had the best luck lately, I'll admit. Richard's money. Sure, it'll help. But I didn't kill him for it, if that's what you're thinking. Poirot's moustache twitched, and Madame Cora, her death. It follows her accusation. You were fond of her. George shrugged, leaning against the glass. Cora was eccentric, always painting, always talking nonsense. I didn't take her seriously, but I liked her well enough. Her murder, oh, that's shaken me. Makes you think someone's got something to hide. Perhaps you, Monsieur George. Poirot's tone was light, but his eyes were sharp as they caught the slight tremor in George's hand. Me, George laughed, but it was forced, brittle. I was in London when Cora was killed, playing cards at the Red Lion. Ask anyone there. I'm not your man, Poirot. Poirot nodded, his gaze lingering on George's expensive watch, slightly scuffed, as if it had been pawned and reclaimed. Regalado de Toledo, José. Hercule Poirot's Christmas Poirot, Agatha Christie Collection P. 33. HarperCollins Publishers. Kindle edition. Reclaimed. And Richard's death. Did you believe Cora's claim? George hesitated, his cocky demeanor slipping. I thought she was raving, like always. But now, I don't know. Richard was old. Sick. I figured he just keeled over. But if Cora was right, he shook his head, tossing the coin again. Look, I just want my share, and to get out of this gloomy place. That's all. Poirot dismissed him with a nod, but as George left, he noticed the young man's pace quicken, as if eager to escape the conservatory's stifling air. Another mental note. George's alibi needed checking, and his nervous energy suggested more than just gambling debts. The theatrical facade, Michael and Rosamond Shane were next, and Poirot chose the music room for their interview, its grand piano and velvet curtains lending a theatrical air that suited the couple. Michael, with his leading man looks, sat with an arm around Rosamond, whose blonde beauty seemed almost too perfect, like a porcelain doll. Yet her eyes held a flicker of unease, and Michael's smile was a touch too polished. Monsieur Poirot, Michael began, his voice warm and rehearsed. We're devastated about Richard and Cora, of course, but I don't see how we can help. We're actors, not detectives. Poirot's smile was polite but piercing. And yet, Monsieur Michael, actors are skilled at observing human nature. Nan, tell me, what did you observe at the will reading, when Madame Cora spoke of murder? Rosamond's fingers tightened on her scarf, a delicate silk thing embroidered with roses. Cora was always dramatic, she said, her voice light but strained. I thought she was just trying to stir things up, but then she was killed, and now, well, it's awful, awful. We, Poirot, agreed. And your financial situation, Madame Rosamond, Monsieur Michael, a theatrical career, it is not always stable, is it? Michael's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone even. We've had ups and downs. Our latest play didn't do as well as we'd hoped. Richard's money will give us a chance to produce something new, something big, but we didn't need to kill for it. Poirot's eyes gleamed. And Madame Cora, did you visit her, perhaps, to discuss the inheritance? Rosamond's cheeks flushed, and she glanced at Michael. "We saw her a few weeks ago," she admitted. "She was kind, but odd. Kept talking about Richard's death as if it was a play she was directing. We didn't take it seriously." Poirot leaned forward. "And the night of her murder, where were you?" Michael answered smoothly. "In London, at our flat, rehearsing lines. You can ask our neighbors, they heard us, I'm sure." Poirot's gaze lingered on Rosamond's scarf, noting a faint smudge near the hemp paint. "Perhaps, merci, madame, monsieur. We shall speak again." As they left, Poirot caught Rosamond's whisper to Michael, "A plan that mustn't fail." The words were soft, almost inaudible, but Poirot's ears were as sharp as his mind. He filed the phrase away, sensing it held a key to their motives. Susan's sharp insights was the last, and Poirot met her in the garden, where she stood by a rosebush, clipping dead blooms with a pair of shears. Her dark hair was pulled back, her expression focused, but she smiled faintly as Poirot approached. "You're not what I expected, Monsieur Poirot," she said, setting the shears down. "I thought you'd be stuffier." Poirot chuckled, his eyes twinkling. "And I thought, Mademoiselle Suzanne, that you would be less direct. You are not like the others, Nan. You see things clearly." Susan shrugged, but her eyes were wary. "I try. Richard was good to me, more than the others. He saw potential in me, wanted me to make something of myself. His money means I can start my own business, not just live off his name." "And Madame, chorus accusations?" Poirot asked, watching her closely. Susan's hand paused on a rose. "I didn't believe it at first. Richard was ill, and Cora loved drama. But after her murder, I'm not so sure. Someone didn't want her talking." Poirot nodded, his mind piecing together the puzzle. "And your family, mademoiselle, do you trust them?" Susan's laugh was sharp, bitter. "Trust in this family. George is a gambler. Timothy's a hypochondriac. Michael and Rosamond are playing some kind of game. No, I don't trust them, but I don't know who'd go as far as murder." Poirot studied her, noting the steel in her voice, the clarity in her gaze. "Merci, Mademoiselle Susan. You have given me much to consider." As Susan returned to her roses, Poirot lingered, his mind alight with possibilities. Each heir had a motive, a secret, a crack in their facade. But Rosamond's whispered words echoed in his thoughts, a thread he would pull until the truth unraveled. The day wore on, and Poirot retired to his room, a small but elegant chamber overlooking the estate's rolling lawns. He sat at a writing desk, his notebook open, jotting down observations in his precise, looping script. Timothy's theatrical ailments, George's nervous energy, Michael and Rosamond's polished lies, Susan's sharp honesty, was a piece of the puzzle. But it was Rosamond's whisper, caught in the music room's heavy air, that gnawed at him. A plan that mustn't fail. What plan? And how did it connect to Cora's murder, to Richard's death? Poirot closed his notebook, his lips curling into a faint smile. The heirs thought they could hide their truths, But Hercule Poirot was a hunter of truths, and no secret could evade him for long. Tomorrow he would dig deeper, starting with the butler Lansquenet, whose hesitant glance suggested he knew more than he let on. For now, Poirot retired to bed, his mind as sharp as the stars piercing the night sky. Chapter 4. The Butler's Secret Glance. The rain had ceased its relentless assault on Enderby Hall, leaving the Gothic manor cloaked in a damp, oppressive silence. The air inside was heavy, not just with the scent of old wood and wax polish, but with the weight of secrets that seemed to seep from the very walls. Hercule Poirot, his small, precise steps echoing faintly on the parquet floor, navigated the labyrinthine corridors of the Abernethy estate with a purpose that belied his unassuming demeanor. His sharp grey eyes, like those of a hawk, missed nothing, not the faint scuff on a baseboard, not the flicker of a curtain in a draughtless room, and certainly not the nervous glance of Lansquenet, the ancient butler, who had served the Abernethy family for nearly half a century. Lansquenet was a relic of a bygone era. His gaunt frame stooped under the burden of years and loyalty. His hands, gnarled as the roots of an ancient oak, trembled slightly as he carried by silver tray laden with a single crystal decanter of sherry. Poirot had observed him earlier that morning, during the strained breakfast, where the heirs picked at their food, their eyes darting like guilty children caught in a lie. Lansquenet had moved with his usual mechanical grace, pouring coffee, clearing plates, but there was something in his posturous stiffness, a hesitation that piqued Poirot's curiosity. It was as if the old man carried an invisible weight, one that had nothing to do with the tray in his hands. Now, as the afternoon sun struggled to pierce the leaden clouds, Poirot found Lansquenet in the butler's pantry, a narrow room tucked behind the dining hall. The space was a shrine to order, shelves lined with gleaming silverware, a row of crystal glasses catching the dim light, and a ledger where Lansquenet meticulously recorded the household's needs. The butler was polishing a silver candelabrum, his movements slow and deliberate, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease when Poirot entered. "Monsieur Lansquenet," Poirot said, his voice smooth as velvet, "a moment of your time, if you please." Lansquemet's hand paused mid-polish, the cloth hovering over the candelabrum's intricate curves. "Of course, Mr. Poirot," he replied, his voice a low, gravelly murmur, tempered by decades of deference. "How may I serve you?" Poirot smiled, a small, disarming gesture that masked the razor-sharp mind at work. "It is not service I seek, but knowledge. You have been with the Abernethys for many years, n'est-ce pas? You know the rhythms of this house, the secrets whispered, put in its shadows." Lansquemet's eyes narrowed just a fraction, but enough for Poirot to note. "I do my duties, sir. I don't pry into family matters." Of course," Poirot said, waving a hand as if to dismiss any suggestion of impropriety. "But a man of your experience, he sees things, Nan, things that others might overlook. For instance, a visitor to Monsieur Richard in the days before his passing. A visitor who, perhaps, left in haste. The cloth slipped from Lansquenet's hand, falling to the table with a soft thud. He recovered quickly, retrieving it and resuming. "'Tis polishing," but the tremble in his fingers was unmistakable. I don't recall any such visitor, sir," he said, his voice tighter now, like a string stretched near its breaking point. Poirot tilted his head, his moustache twitching slightly. "Come now, Monsieur Lansquenet. The memory, it is a curious thing. Sometimes it hides, but with a little encouragement it returns. Let us try again." A visitor, perhaps late in the evening, when the house was quiet. Lansquenet's jaw tightened, and for a moment Poirot thought the old man might bolt. But instead, he set the candelabrum down with a clink and folded his hands, as if steeling himself. There was someone, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "A man, I think. I didn't see his face. He came to the service entrance 2 nights before Mr. Richard passed. I heard voices Mr. Richard's raised, and another, low and urgent. By the time I reached the study, the visitor was gone. Mr. Richard told me it was nothing, just a business matter." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "A business matter, you say, at such an hour, and yet you did not see this man's face. Curious. Nan, did you hear a name, perhaps, or catch a glimpse of his attire?" Lansquenet shook his head, his gaze dropping to the table. "No name, sir, only a shadow, moving quickly down the garden path. He wore a dark coat, I think, and a hat pulled low. I didn't think it my place to ask." Poirot nodded, as if satisfied, but his mind was racing. A mysterious visitor, an argument, and Richard Abernethy's death 2 days later natural, according to the doctor, but now tinged with suspicion, thanks to Cora's accusation and her own brutal murder. Lansquenet's reticence suggested fear, pay, or perhaps loyalty to someone other than the late patriarch. Poirot decided to press further, but gently, like a fisherman teasing a wary trout. "You are loyal, Monsieur Lansquenet," Poirot said, his tone softening. "It is admirable, this devotion to the family. But loyalty, it can blind us to the truth. If there is more you know about this visitor, or about Monsieur Richard's state of mind, you must tell me, for the sake of justice." Eyes met Poirot's, and for a moment the butler's mask of composure slipped, revealing a flicker of anguish. "Justice," he murmured, as if the word were a bitter pill. "I've served this family since I was a lad, Mr. Poirot. I've beseen their triumphs, their sorrows, their sins, but I've kept my place, always." Poirot leaned forward, his voice low and compelling. "And yet your place, it is not just to serve, but to protect Nan, to protect the truth, even when it is painful. Tell me, Lansquenet, what did you see in Monsieur Richard's study that night? What did you hear?" The butler's hands clenched, his knuckles whitening. "I heard anger," he said at last. "Mr. Richard was shouting about betrayal, about someone he trusted turning against him. The other voice, I couldn't make out the words, but it was pleading, desperate. I thought it was just a quarrel, nothing more. But when Mr. Richard died, and then Miss Cora," his voice broke, and he looked away, his eyes glistening. Poirot's heart quickened, but he kept his expression neutral. "And after this visitor left, did you notice anything unusual in the study? A paper out of place, perhaps, or an object missing?" Lansquenet hesitated, then nodded slowly. "There was a glass," he said, "one of Mr. Richard's crystal tumblers, on the desk. It wasn't there when I cleaned the room earlier that day, and it smelled odd, like bitter almonds, but faint. I thought nothing of it at the time. I washed it and put it away." Poirot's moustache quivered, a sign of his mind's sudden acceleration. Bitter almonds, a scent often associated with cyanide, though he knew it could be something else, something less sinister. Digitalis, perhaps, given Richard's heart condition. The glass was gone now, washed clean, but the detail was a thread to tug, a clue to weave into the tapestry of suspicion. "Merci, Monsieur Lansquenet," Poirot said, rising from his chair. "You have been most helpful. But one more thing, where is this glass now?" Lansquenet pointed to a shelf above the sink, where a row of crystal tumblers gleamed. "There, sir, third from the left. I keep them all in order." Poirot crossed to the shelf, his gloved fingers lifting the tumbler with care. He held it to the light, inspecting it for any trace of residue, but it sparkled with the clarity of a diamond. Still, he wrapped it in a handkerchief and slipped it into his pocket. "For safekeeping," he said, with a reassuring smile. "You will say nothing of this to the others, Lansquenet nodded, his face pale. "As you wish, sir." As Poirot left the pantry, he felt the weight of the tumbler in his pocket, a tangible link to the mystery. But his thoughts were interrupted by a sudden clatter from the dining hall. He quickened his pace, emerging to find Timothy Abernethy, the hypochondriac brother, sprawled on the floor, his wheelchair tipped over. Maud, his wife, was kneeling beside him, her face a mask of concern, while Susan, the sharp-witted niece, stood nearby, her expression unreadable, an accident. Maud cried, her voice shrill. He reached for his medicine and lost his balance. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he took in the scene. Timothy's face was flushed, his breathing labored, but his eyes darted to Poirot, with a flicker of something fear, perhaps, or calculation. The medicine bottle lay on its side, a few white pills scattered across the floor like fallen snow. Poirot knelt, picking up one of the pills with his handkerchief, and sniffed it delicately. No scent of almonds, but something acrid, unfamiliar. "Accident, you say?" Poirot murmured, his gaze shifting to Maud. "Or perhaps a warning." Maud's eyes widened, but she said nothing, her hands tightening on Timothy's arm. Susan stepped forward, her voice cool. "He's always reaching for things he shouldn't. It's his nerves, Mr. Poirot. This house is getting to us all." Poirot nodded, but his mind was elsewhere, piecing together the fragments. Lansquenet's story of the visitor, the mysterious glass, Timothy's fall, and now the pills. Were they connected, or was the house's atmosphere of suspicion clouding his judgment? He resolved to keep a closer eye on Timothy and Maud, whose fierce protectiveness seemed to hide something deeper. That evening, as the heirs gathered for another tense dinner, Poirot watched Lansquenet closely. The butler moved with his usual precision, serving soup with a steady hand. But Poirot noticed a new detail. Lansquene's left cufflink was missing, revealing a frayed cuff and a faint smudge of ink on his wrist. Ink, Poirot thought, was not something a butler typically encountered in his duties. Had Lansquene been writing something, perhaps a note, a confession, or a warning? After dinner, Poirot lingered in the drawing-room, pretending to admire a portrait of Richard Abernethy's stern-faced father. When the others had retired, he slipped back to the butler's pantry, now empty and shadowed. The ledger caught his eye, its pages filled with neat entries of supplies and expenses. But as he flipped through it, a single sheet fell loose, a note, written in Lansquene's meticulous hand, but unfinished. I cannot keep silent any longer. The truth about Mr. Richard's visitor must be. The note ended abruptly, as if Lansquene had been interrupted. Poirot's pulse quickened. He tucked the note into his pocket beside the tumbler, and made his way to Lansquene's quarters, a small room off the servants' wing. The door was ajar, and inside, Poirot found the butler hunched over a desk, a pen in his trembling hand. A single candle cast long shadows, and Lansquene's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Monsieur Lansquene," Poirot said softly, closing the door behind him. "It is time, I think, for the truth." Lansquene started, nearly knocking over the candle. "Mr. Poirot, I was just writing a letter to my sister. Nothing important." Poirot held up the unfinished note, his expression stern. It is not a letter to your sister. It is a confession, Nan, or perhaps a plea for help. Tell me, Lansquene, who was the visitor, and why do you fear to speak?" The butler's shoulders slumped, and for a moment Poirot thought he might collapse. But then Lansquene straightened, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "It was Mr. Timothy," he said. "I lied before, Mr. Poirot. I saw him that night, in the study with Mr. Richard. They were arguing about money, about the will." Mr. Timothy was shouting, saying Mr. Richard was a fool to trust the others. "I didn't want to believe it meant anything, but after Miss Cora, I'm afraid, sir, afraid of what he might do." Poirot's mind raced. Timothy, the hypochondriac, confined to a wheelchair, or so he claimed. Could he have been mobile enough to visit Richard in secret, to slip something into a glass, to silence Cora when she grew too curious? And yet Lansquene's fear suggested another layer. Perhaps Timothy was not acting alone. "Thank you, Monsieur Lansquene," Poirot said, his voice calm but firm. "You have done the right thing, but you must do one more thing for me. Tonight, before you retire, place this under your door." He handed Lansquene a folded note, sealed with wax. "It is for your protection and for mine." Lansquene took the note, his hand shaking. "What does it say, sir?" Poirot smiled, a glint, mischief in his eyes. "It says that Hercule Poirot is watching, and that the truth, it will not stay hidden for long." As Poirot left the butler's room, the house seemed to close in around him, its shadows deeper, its silence heavier. He knew the note he had given Lansquene was a gambler lure, to draw out the guilty, to provoke a reaction. But he also knew that Enderby Hall was a house of mirrors, where every reflection hid a lie. Timothy, Maud, the mysterious visitor, the glass, the ink-stained cuff, they were pieces of a puzzle, and Poirot was determined to fit them together. He paused in the hallway, his hand resting on the tumbler in his pocket. Tomorrow he would send it to a chemist for analysis. Tomorrow he would confront Timothy, but tonight he would watch and listen and wait for the house to reveal its next secret. The chapter closed with Poirot slipping the note under Lanscombe's door, his footsteps fading into the darkness of Enderby Hall. The butler, alone in his room, stared at the sealed note, his heart pounding. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked, and Lanscombe's candle flickered, as if stirred by an unseen breath. Chapter 5. The poisoned past the rain had stopped, but Enderby Hall's stone walls glistened under a sky bruised with clouds. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood and wax polish. A heavy stillness, broken only by the faint clink of teacups in the drawing-room. Hercule Poirot stood by a tall window, his gloved hands clasped behind his back, gazing at the sodden lawns stretching toward the iron gates. His mustache twitched as he considered the puzzle before him. Richard Abernethy's death, Cora Lansquenet, murder, and the web of greed binding the heirs. Each piece was a thread, and he sensed a knot forming in the pattern, one tied to poison. The morning had begun with a summons from Mr. Entwistle, the family solicitor, whose pinched face betrayed sleepless nights. Over breakfast, Entwistle had shared a troubling detail. Richard Abernethy had been under Dr. Larrabee's care for a heart condition, treated with digitalis, a standard prescription, Entwistle had said, stirring his tea with unnecessary vigor. But I can't shake the feeling something's amiss. Richard was frail, yes, but his death came so conveniently. Poirot's eyes had gleamed. Convenient, you say? For whom, monsieur? Entwistle had faltered, his spoon clattering against the saucer. Well, the heirs, I suppose. The fortune is vast millions in property, stocks, and cash. But I'm no detective, Poirot. That's why you're here. Now, as Poirot stood in the drawing-room, he resolved to visit Dr. Larrabee. The doctor's surgery was in the nearby village of Litchit, St. Mary, a short drive through winding lanes. Poirot adjusted his hat, summoned the chauffeur, and stepped into the sleek Bentley waiting at the manor's entrance. The drive was silent, save for the hum of the engine and the occasional squeak of wipers against the drizzle-damp windshield. Poirot's mind churned, piecing together fragments. Cora's accusation of murder, her own brutal death, and the heirs' hungry glances at the will reading. Litchit St. Mary was a quaint village, its cottages huddled around a mossy church. Dr. Larrabee's surgery occupied a red brick building with a creaking sign that read, Medical Practice, EST 1890. Poirot pushed open the door, a bell jangling above. The waiting-room smelled of antiseptic and damp wool, its chairs occupied by a coughing farmer and an elderly woman clutching a handkerchief. A nurse, her starched cap slightly askew, ushered Poirot into the doctor's office. Dr. Larrabee was a wiry man in his 50s, with graying temples and spectacles perched on a hawkish nose. His desk was cluttered with papers, a stethoscope dangling from a hook like a noose. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, rising with a wary smile, mentioned you'd call. Dreadful business about the Abernethy." "The doctor," Poirot replied, settling into a creaky chair. "I am here to discuss Monsieur Richard Abernethy's health. You prescribe digitalis." Larrabee nodded, adjusting his glasses. "Yes, for his heart arrhythmia. A common treatment. Digitalis strengthens the heartbeat, but it must be taken precisely. Too much can be toxic." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And Monsieur Abernethy?" He followed this precision. "As far as I know," Larrabee said, his fingers drumming the desk, "I visited him weekly at Enderby. He seemed stable, though weak. His death was sudden, but not unexpected, given his condition." Poirot leaned forward, his voice soft but piercing. "Sudden, you say? Tell me, doctor, did you examine the body after his passing?" Larrabee hesitated, his drumming fingers stilling. "Well, no. The family saw no need. Richard's symptoms aligned with heart failure. I signed the death certificate based on my prior observations." Poirot's mustache quivered, a sign of displeasure. "No autopsy, no confirmation. This is most irregular, none." The doctor flushed. "It's not uncommon in such cases, Monsieur. The Abernethys are respected, and Richard was elderly. An autopsy seemed unnecessary." Poirot did not press further, but his mind catalogued the doctor's unease. He thanked Larrabee and left, pausing outside to light a cigarette, a rare indulgence, reserved for moments of deep thought. The digitalis intrigued him. A poison disguised as medicine, easily mismeasured, deadly in excess. But who would tamper with it, and why? His next stop was Enderby Hall's library, where he hoped to inspect Richard's personal effects. The room was vast, its shelves groaning with leather-bound tomes and dusty ledgers. A portrait of Richard hung above the fireplace, his stern gaze softened by a faint smile. Poirot approached the desk where Richard had spent his final days, now cleared but for a blotter and an inkwell. He opened the drawers, finding only stationery and a few pens. Then, in the bottom drawer, his fingers brushed a small wooden box. Its lid carved with ivy. Inside was a glass bottle, half filled with tiny white tablets. The label read, "Digitalis, 0.1 milligrams." Dr. Larrabee, Poirot's pulse quickened. He pocketed the bottle, intending to compare it with the prescription records. But as he closed the drawer, a floorboard creaked behind him. He turned to find Susan Banks, Richard's sharp-witted niece, standing in the doorway. Her auburn hair was pinned loosely, and her green eyes held a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice cool. "Snooping, are we?" Poirot smiled, unruffled. "Not snooping, mademoiselle. Investigating the truth. It hides in the smallest corners." Susan stepped closer, her arms crossed. "And what truth are you chasing?" "That Uncle Richard was murdered, like Cora said." Poirot tilted his head, studying her. You believe this, perhaps?" She hesitated, then sighed. "I don't know. Uncle Richard was kind to me more than to the others. He trusted me, but he was worried in his last week, skept, saying the family was rotten at the core. I thought it was just his illness talking." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "And this illness, it was only the heart." Susan frowned. "That's what Dr. Larrabee said, but there was something else. A family story, half forgotten, about Uncle Richard's first wife, Eleanor. She died young, before I was born. They said it was pneumonia, but my mother always hinted it was. Strange." Poirot's interest sharpened. "Strange how?" Susan glanced at the portrait, as if fearing Richard's disapproval. "Mother claimed Eleanor was healthy until she wasn't. One day she was fine, the next she was bedridden, then gone. No one questioned it. Richard was heartbroken, and the family closed ranks. But Mother swore Eleanor's symptoms weren't pneumonia. She was confused, vomiting, seeing things." Poirot's mind raced. Digitalis poisoning could mimic such symptoms: nausea, hallucinations, weakness. And this rumor, it was never investigated. Susan shook her head. "The Abernethys don't air their laundry. But I've always wondered. And now, with Cora's murder," her voice trailed off, her fingers twisting a silver locket at her throat. Poirot noted the locket, its surface engraved with a rose. "That is a fine piece, mademoiselle. A gift." Susan's hand dropped, as if caught, from Uncle Richard. "He gave it to me last Christmas. Said it was special, but never explained why." "May I see it?" Poirot asked, his tone gentle, reluctantly. Susan unclasped the locket and handed it over. Inside was a faded photograph of a young woman with soft curls and a wistful smile. Poirot's breath caught. "This is Madame Eleanor." Susan nodded. "I found the photo in Uncle Richard's study after he died. I thought it felt right to keep it close." Poirot returned the locket, his mind whirling. Eleanor's death, Richard's digitalis, Cora's accusation threads, converging on a single question. Was Richard's death the second act of a long-buried crime? He needed Richard's medical records, and he needed them now, that afternoon. Poirot telephoned Dr. Larrabee's office, requesting the records be sent to Enderby. The nurse promised delivery by evening, but her voice held a tremor that piqued Poirot's curiosity. Was she nervous, or was someone listening? He decided to visit the surgery again, unannounced. The village was quieter now, the church bells tolling 4 o'clock. Poirot entered the surgery without ringing the bell, slipping into the empty waiting room. Voices drifted from the office Larrabee's, low and urgent, and another unfamiliar, sharp with anger. "You should have destroyed that bottle, not left it lying about." The stranger hissed. "It was locked in my cabinet," Larrabee protested. No one could have. Poirot eased closer, peering through the cracked door. Larrabee stood by his desk, facing a man in a dark coat, his back to Poirot. The man's shoulders were tense, his hands clenched. "If Poirot finds it, we're finished," the stranger said. "Get rid of it, or I will." Larrabee's face paled. I can't just. The stranger turned, and Poirot glimpsed his profile sharp cheekbones, a scar above the brow. Then the man strode out, brushing past Poirot without a glance. Poirot memorized the face, his heart pounding. Who was this man, and what bottle did he fear? He entered the office, startling Larrabee. "Monsieur Poirot, I didn't hear you." "Evidently." Poirot said dryly. "Who was your visitor, Doctor?" Larrabee stammered. "Just a patient. Nothing to do with the Abernethys." "Poirot, let the lie pass, for now. I came for the records. Are they ready?" "They'll be sent tonight," Larrabee said, avoiding Poirot's gaze. "I'm still compiling them." Poirot nodded, but his suspicion deepened. Back at Enderby, he found the heirs gathered for dinner, the atmosphere taut as a violin string. Timothy Abernethy, Richard's hypochondriac brother, dominated the conversation, complaining of palpitations. Maud, his wife, hovered protectively, while George, the gambling cousin, downed wine with reckless abandon. Michael and Rosamond, put the theatrical couple, exchanged furtive glances, and Susan sat quietly, her locket gleaming under the chandelier. As the soup was served, Susan leaned toward Poirot. "Did you find anything today?" Poirot smiled faintly. "The truth, mademoiselle, is like a pearl. It forms slowly, layer by layer, but I have found a crack in the shell." Susan's eyes widened, but before she could reply, Timothy coughed, violently, clutching his chest. Maud rushed to his side, producing a vial of pills. "His heart medicine," she explained, her voice tight. Poirot watched closely, noting the label, Digitalis. The coincidence was too stark. He resolved to test the bottle from Richard's desk and compare it with Timothy's prescription. If they matched or didn't, the answer might lie there after dinner. The medical records arrived, delivered by a nervous messenger boy. Poirot retired to the library, spreading the papers across the desk. Richard's file was meticulous. Weekly visits, digitalis doses carefully noted. But one entry stood out: a prescription for an extra bottle, issued 2 days before Richard's death, with no explanation. Larrabee's signature was shaky, unlike the rest. Poirot leaned back, his fingers steepled. An extra bottle, unaccounted for. A stranger warning Larrabee to destroy evidence. Eleanor's mysterious death, echoing Richard's, and Cora, silenced before she could reveal more. The puzzle was taking shape, but one piece eluded him: the scarred man's identity. He rose, pacing the library. The portrait of Richard seemed to watch him, its eyes holding a silent plea. Poirot paused, struck by a thought. The locket Susan had found the photo in Richard's study. Perhaps other secrets hid there, overlooked by the heirs. He searched the study again, this time lifting the rug beneath the desk. A loose floorboard yielded to his touch, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed. Poirot opened it, his breath catching at the first line. "I fear I have been betrayed, and Eleanor's ghost demands justice." The journal chronicled Richard's growing distrust of his family, his suspicion that death was no accident. "I found her medicine tampered with," he wrote, "digitalis in doses too high. I confronted E, but they denied it. Now I feel the same shadow over me." The final entry, dated the day before his death, read, "I must act, or I am next. The will must change." Poirot closed the journal, his mind ablaze. E, again the same initial from the hidden letters. But who was E. Entwistle? Eleanor herself, long dead? Or someone closer, like Maud, whose devotion to Timothy bordered on obsession? As midnight chimed, Poirot slipped the journal into his coat. He would confront Larrabee tomorrow, armed with the extra bottle and Richard's words. But as he left the study, a shadow moved in the hall, a figure in a dark coat, scar glinting in the moonlight. The stranger from the surgery. Poirot froze, his hand on his cane. The man vanished around a corner, his footsteps fading. Poirot followed, heart pounding, but found only an open window, curtains fluttering in the night breeze. The intruder was gone, but his presence confirmed Poirot's fears. Someone was desperate to bury the truth. He returned to his room, locking the door. The journal lay heavy in his pocket, its secrets burning. Tomorrow he would unravel the poisoned pastor risk, becoming its next victim. Chapter 6. The gambler's desperate Betherain had stopped, but the air in London carried a damp chill as Hercule Poirot stepped off the train at Paddington Station. His polished shoes clicked against the wet cobblestones, and his moustache twitched as he inhaled the city's sooty breath. Enderby Hall's suffocating tension lingered in his mind, but now his focus was sharper, narrower. George Crossfield, the gambling cousin, whose nervous glances and evasive answers at the family dinner had piqued Poirot's curiosity. There was something in George's eyes, a flicker of desperation, like a cornered animal. Poirot had seen that look before, and it rarely lied. He adjusted his hat and hailed a cab, directing the driver to a less savory corner of Soho. Entwistle, the solicitor, had let slip that George frequented a certain establishment, the Black Ace Casino, a place where fortunes were lost faster than reputations. If George was hiding something, and Poirot was certain he was, the casino's smoky haze might reveal it. The cab rattled through streets alive with neon and shadow. Poirot's mind churned, replaying Cora's murder, the hatchet, the muddy footprint, the half-finished painting with its eerie figure at the window. Then there was Richard Abernethy's death, supposedly natural, but Cora's accusation. He was murdered, wasn't he? Hung like a guillotine. George, with his debts and restless demeanor, was a thread worth pulling. The Black Ace Casino was a squat, unassuming building tucked between a pawnbroker and a shuttered tailor's shop. Its sin flickered, one letter perpetually dark, giving it the air of a place that thrived on half-truths. Poirot paid the driver and stepped inside, his senses assaulted by the clatter of roulette wheels, the low hum of voices, and the acrid sting of cigarette smoke. Men in ill-fitting suits and women with tired eyes crowded the tables, their laughter brittle, their hopes pinned on the next roll of dice. Poirot's sharp eyes scanned the room. George was easy to spot, hunched over a blackjack table. His tie loosened and his face flushed with the fever of a man chasing losses. His fingers drummed the table as the dealer slid a card his way. Poirot lingered near a slot machine, pretending to fumble with coins while observing. George's stack of chips was pitifully small, and his glances darted not just to the cards, but to a man in a pinstriped suit leaning against the bar, watching him with the patience of a vulture. Poirot approached the bar, ordering a tisane to the bartender's bemusement, and positioned himself to overhear George's muttered curses. "One more hand," George said to the dealer, his voice tight. "Double it." The dealer, a wiry man with a scar above his eyebrow, shrugged and dealt. George lost again, his shoulders sagging as he pushed his last chips forward. The man in the pinstriped suit moved closer, his presence like a storm cloud. Poirot caught snatches of their exchange. "You're late, Crossfield," the man growled, his accent thick with East End grit. "Mr. Vargo don't like waiting." George stammered something about needing time, but the man's hand clamped firm to his shoulder, steering him toward a back room. Poirot followed at a discreet distance, his cane tapping softly. The casino's rear corridor was dimly lit, lined with peeling wallpaper and the faint smell of stale beer. He paused outside a door marked "Private," where muffled voices leaked through. George's voice was high, pleading, "I'll get by it, I swear. Just give me a week, a week." The other man scoffed. "You said that last month, and Mr. Vargo's out $5,000. You think he's running a charity?" Poirot's moustache twitched. £5,000 was no small sum, and George's inheritance from Richard's substantial but not yet distributed would be more than enough to clear it. But why the urgency, and why the fear in George's voice, sharper than a man merely dodging creditors? The door creaked open, and Poirot slipped into an alcove, watching as George emerged, pale and sweating. The pinstriped man followed, lighting a cigarette. "Tomorrow night, Crossfield, or you'll be sorry." George nodded, his hands shaking as he stuffed them into his pockets and hurried toward the exit. Poirot trailed him into the street, where George ducked into an alley, unaware of his shadow. The night was alive with the clatter of bins and distant laughter, but George's pace was frantic, his head swiveling as if expecting pursuit. At the alley's end, he stopped at a phone box, fumbling coins with trembling fingers. Poirot crept closer, his ears straining. "Listen," George whispered into the receiver, his voice barely audible. "It's done. I gave him the note, but he's not happy. Says we need to move faster." A pause. Then, "No, I didn't tell him about her. But if this goes wrong, we're both finished." He hung up, cursing under his breath, and lit a cigarette with a match that flared briefly in the dark. Poirot's mind raced a note, a mysterious hymn, and a her, Cora, perhaps, or someone else entirely. George's call suggested a conspiracy, one tied to the murders and Richard's fortune. Poirot resolved to intercept that note, but first He needed to confront George, to see how he'd react under pressure. He stepped forward, his cane clicking deliberately. George spun, dropping his cigarette. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "Only a friend, Monsieur Crossfield," Poirot said, emerging into the streetlight's glow. His tone was calm, but his eyes were sharp, pinning George. "Like a specimen, or perhaps not a friend, if you are keeping secrets that belong to the dead." George's face drained of color. "Poirot, what the devil are you doing here?" "A question I might ask you," Poirot replied, twirling his cane. "A man in your position, debts, threats, late-night phone calls does not inspire confidence. Tell me, why did you visit your Uncle Richard the day he died?" George flinched, as if struck. I didn't. Do not lie to her." "Poirot," he said softly, his voice like a blade wrapped in silk. "You were seen at Enderby Hall. Lansquenet, the butler, mentioned a visitor. And now, here you are, consorting with men who do not play games of chance with cards alone." George's eyes darted, searching for an escape. But Poirot stepped closer, his presence commanding. "I needed money," George blurted. "Richard had plenty, but he wouldn't give me a penny. Said I'd squandered enough. I left, that's all." And yet Poirot said, "Your cousin Cora believed Richard was murdered, and now Cora is dead, her head split by a hatchet. You, monsieur, are in debt to dangerous men. A coincidence, perhaps." George's nervous twitch at the corner of his mouth betrayed him. "I didn't kill anyone," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Cora was crazy, always stirring trouble." Poirot tilted his head. "Crazy enough to die for it. Or did she know something about you? Something you could not afford to let spread?" He paused, letting the silence press on George's nerves. "What was in the note you passed tonight?" George's hand went to his pocket, then froze. "What note?" Poirot smiled, thin and knowing. "Do not play the fool. I heard you in the alley. You spoke of a note, of a her, of moving faster. Tell me, or I shall take my suspicions to the police and to Mr. Vargo, who seems less forgiving than I." The mention of Vargo broke George. He sagged against the phone box, his bravado crumbling. "It's not what you think," he whispered. "I'm in over my head, yes. But I didn't kill Richard or Cora. The note, it was just instructions, payment details. Vargo's men want their money, and I'm trying to get it." "From whom?" Poirot pressed George, hesitated, his eyes flickering with fear. "I can't say they'll kill me, and if you do not speak, I shall ensure Mr. Vargo knows you've been talking to me," Poirot said, his voice cold. "Choose your poison, monsieur." George's shoulders slumped. It's someone in the family," he admitted. "They've got a plan to get the money faster, to split it before the will's settled. I don't know all the details, just my part. I pass messages. Keep Vargo's men off my back." Poirot's mind word. A family member conspiring with George. The heirs Timothy, Maud, Susan, Michael, Rosamond all had motives. But this suggested a partnership, a calculated scheme. "Who is her?" he asked. George shook his head, his tic worsening. I've said too much. Please, Poirot, leave it alone. Nan, Poirot said firmly, you will give me the note, or I shall follow you until I have it. And I assure you, I am most persistent. George's hand trembled as he reached into his coat, pulling out a crumpled slip of paper. He thrust it at Poirot, his eyes wild. Take it, but don't say I didn't warn you. Poirot unfolded the note, his gloved fingers careful. In hurried scrawl it read, "Meet at the dock, midnight tomorrow. Bring the ledger." No tricks, no signature, but the handwriting was sharp, angular, familiar, though Poirot couldn't place it. He pocketed the note, his gaze never leaving George. "You will say nothing of this to your accomplice," he said, "and you will stay away from the docks tomorrow night. Hercule Poirot will take your place." George gaped, but Poirot was already turning, his cane tapping as he vanished into the fog. The note burned in his pocket, a key to unlocking the Abernethy conspiracy. But the docks were no place for a gentleman detective, and Poirot knew he'd need more than his wits to face what awaited the next day. Poirot prepared meticulously. He contacted Inspector Morton, a reliable Scotland Yard man, to arrange discreet surveillance at the docks. He also enlisted Entwistle, who, though shaken by the case's escalation, agreed to provide details about the family's financial dealings. The ledger mentioned in the note was likely Richard's private account book, rumored to detail his investments and loans, perhaps even bribes or blackmail. If it existed, it was a motive for murder. As night fell, Poirot donned a plain overcoat, foregoing his usual finery to blend into the dockside shadows. The Thames was a black ribbon under the moon, its banks lined with cranes and warehouses. The air smelled of tar and fish, and a distant clank of ship's rigging set Poirot's nerves on edge. He stationed himself behind a stack of crates, his eyes fixed on the meeting point, a rusted lamppost near a derelict pier dot at midnight. A figure approached, cloaked in a hooded coat. Poirot's heart quickened. The figure's gait was deliberate, feminine, and when a gust of wind lifted the hood, he glimpsed a flash of blonde hair. Rosamond, Susan, or someone else entirely. The figure stopped under the lamppost, clutching a parcel, likely the ledger, before Poirot could move. Another shadow emerged, burly man with a scar on his cheek, one of Vargo's enforcers. "You got it," the man growled. The figure nodded. "Passing the parcel. Tell Vargo it's all there. But this is the last time." The man snorted, flipping through the parcel's contents. "We'll see about that. You're in deep now, lady." Poirot's mind raced. A woman in the family, entangled with Vargo's gang. He stepped forward, intending to confront them, but a sudden noise, a crate toppling, alerted the pair. The woman fled, her hood falling to reveal Rosamond's unmistakable profile. The enforcer cursed and bolted in the opposite direction, the ledger tucked under his arm. Poirot gave chase, but Rosamond vanished into the maze of warehouses. He signaled Morton's men, who apprehended the enforcer, recovering the ledger. Back at his flat, Poirot examined it. Pages of transactions, some marked with initials R.A. for Richard Abernethy, But others, like E, echoed the letters from Enderby's hidden room. One entry stood out. Alone to Ars Rosamond Shane, dated a week before Richard's death. The chapter closed with Poirot at his desk, the ledger open before him, his eyes gleaming with purpose. Rosamond's involvement was no longer a suspicion but a fact, and her connection to Vargo's men tied her to George's desperation. Yet the ledger's secrets were only half revealed, and Poirot knew the next move confronting Rosamond would be his most dangerous yet. The net was tightening, but the killer's shadow loomed larger, and Enderby's ghosts were far from silent. Chapter 7. The actresses massed. The rain had stopped, but Enderby Hall's stone walls glistened under a moonless sky, as if the manor itself were sweating from the secrets it held. Hercule Poirot, his moustache impeccably trimmed despite the late hour, stood in the conservatory, where glass panes rattled faintly in the wind. He had arranged to meet Rosamond Shane, the aspiring actress and one of Richard Abernethy's heirs, under the pretense of admiring her theatrical talents. But Poirot's true aim was sharper, to peel back the layers of her charm and uncover what lay beneath her polished performance. Rosamond arrived precisely at 10, her silk dress rustling like a whisper in the dim light, her blonde curls framed, a face that could shift from radiant to enigmatic with a single tilt of her head. She carried herself with the poise of someone accustomed to an audience. Yet Poirot noted a flicker of unease in her blue eyes as she greeted him. "Monsieur Poirot, you flatter me with this private audience," she said, her voice lilting with practiced warmth. "I hope you're not expecting a full performance. I'm rather out of practice since Uncle Richard's passing." Poirot inclined his head, his eyes gleaming with quiet amusement. "Mademoiselle Shane, every moment in your presence is a performance. None. But tonight I wish only for a conversation, a monologue, perhaps, about the night of your Aunt Cora's unfortunate demise." Rosamond's smile faltered, but she recovered swiftly, gesturing to a wicker chair. "Let's sit, then. It's chilly in here, don't you think? Like a stage, before the curtains rise." She settled gracefully, crossing her ankles, but Poirot noticed her fingers tighten briefly on the armrest. He took the opposite chair, his small frame somehow commanding the space. "Mademoiselle, you told the police you were rehearsing alone at the Lyric Theatre the evening Cora Lansquenet was murdered. A solitary endeavor, oui. Yet I find it curious, an actress of your talent, alone, when the world craves your presence." Rosamond laughed, a sound like crystal but edged with strain. "Oh, Monsieur Poirot, you're too kind. But yes, I was at the Lyric, running lines for a new play. Michael, my husband, you know, was off with his agent, and I needed the quiet. The stage is my sanctuary." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly, though his smile remained. "A sanctuary, indeed. And yet, mademoiselle, I have found a small inconsistency." From his pocket he produced a crumpled theatre ticket stub, holding it delicately between 2 fingers. "This was in your purse, tucked among your cosmetics. A ticket to the Gaiety Theatre, dated the night of Cora's murder, for a performance of the Moonlit Betrayal. not the lyric Nan. The conservatory seemed to grow colder. Rosamond's gaze darted to the ticket, and for a moment her mask slipped, her lips parted, and her breath hitched. Then, with an actress's discipline, she steadied herself, leaning back with a sigh. "You're thorough, aren't you? All right. I'll confess to a little fib. I wasn't at the lyric. I went to the Gaiety to see a rival's performance. Professional curiosity, you understand. I didn't mention it because, well, it's embarrassing to admit I'm scouting the competition." Poirot tilted his head, studying her as if she were a painting with a hidden flaw. Embarrassing, perhaps, but curious, also, that you chose that night to visit the Gaiety when your aunt was struck down so brutally, and curiouser still, mademoiselle, that you visited Cora earlier that day. Rosamond's eyes widened, but she caught herself before the surprise could fully bloom. "Who told you that Susan? She's always poking her nose where it doesn't belong." "Yes, I saw Cora. Needed to borrow some money. She was always good for a loan, eccentric as she was. But I left her alive, Monsieur Poirot. I swear it." Poirot leaned forward, his voice soft but unyielding. "Then perhaps you can explain, mademoiselle, the smudge of paint on your coat. A vibrant ultramarine, identical to the pigments found in Cora's cottage. Be color not used in any theatre backdrop, I assure you." Rosamond froze, her hands clasping together in her lap. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint creak of the conservatory's glass. Then, with a sudden laugh, she rose, pacing, toe a potted fern, and brushing its leaves with her fingertips. "You're relentless, aren't you? Fine. I'll tell you the truth, or as much as I can. I went to Cora's cottage to ask for money. Yes, but it wasn't just a loan. She offered me something else. A deal." Poirot's eyebrows lifted, but he remained silent, letting her words spill into the quiet. Rosamond turned, her face half-shadowed. "Cora was painting when I arrived, working on that dreadful canvas of Enderby Hall. She was in one of her moods, rambling about Uncle Richard's death, saying it wasn't natural. She told me she'd found something, a letter, she said, hidden in Richard's study. She thought it proved he'd been poisoned. She offered to give it to me, for a price, not money, but a favor." "A favor," Poirot echoed, his tone deceptively mild. Rosamond nodded, her voice dropping to a whisper. "She wanted me to convince Michael to abandon his new play. It's a risky project, and Cora thought it would ruin us financially. She said if I did that, she'd hand over the letter, and I could use it, too, to protect our inheritance. I refused. It was absurd, manipulative. I left her cottage in a huff, and yes, I must have brushed against her easel. That's where the paint came from." Poirot steepled his fingers, his eyes never leaving her. "And this letter, mademoiselle, did you see it?" "No," Rosamond said quickly, too quickly. "She only mentioned it. I thought she was bluffing, trying to control me like she did everyone else. Cora loved her little games." Poirot rose, adjusting his coat with precision. "Games, indeed. And yet, mademoiselle, I wonder if you are not playing one yourself." A letter that proves murder is a dangerous thing to leave behind. Tell me, did you return to the cottage later that night, perhaps to search for this letter?" Rosamond's face paled, but she lifted her chin defiantly. "I did not. I was at the Gaiety, as you know, and then I went home. Michael can confirm it." Michael Poirot mused. "Who was not with you at the theatre. A convenient alibi, Nan. But let us leave that for now. I thank you for your candor, mademoiselle. We shall speak again." As Rosamond swept out of the conservatory, her heels clicking on the tiles, Poirot lingered, his gaze drifting to the fern she'd touched. He plucked a leaf, noting a faint trace of ultramarine paint on its edge. "Curious," he murmured, slipping the leaf into his pocket. The next morning, Poirot took the train to London, determined to verify Rosamond's story. The Gaiety Theatre, a gaudy confection of red velvet and gold trim, was quiet in the daylight, its marquee proclaiming the moonlit betrayal in bold letters. Poirot found the box office clerk, a young man with ink-stained fingers, who confirmed Rosamond's presence at the evening performance. "Oh, I remember her," the clerk said, blushing. "Pretty lady, sat in the balcony, left before. The curtain call, though, seemed in a hurry." Poirot thanked him and made his way to the Lyric Theatre, where Rosamond claimed to rehearse. The stage manager, a gruff woman named Mrs. Harrow, scoffed at the idea. "Rosamond Shane. Haven't seen her here in weeks. She's been too busy with that husband of hers, chasing investors for their new show. Rehearsing alone. My foot." Poirot's suspicions deepened. Rosamond's lie about the lyric was deliberate, but why? To conceal her visit to Cora or something more? He decided to visit Michael Shane, who was staying at a modest flat in Soho while preparing for his play's debut. Michael greeted Poirot with a weary smile, his actor's charm dimmed by dark circles under his eyes. The flat was cluttered with scripts and empty coffee cups, a stark contrast to Rosamond's elegance. "Monsieur Poirot, to what do I owe the pleasure?" Michael asked, offering a chair piled with papers. Poirot waved off the seat, preferring to stand. "Monsieur Shane, I am curious about your wife's movements on the night of Cora Lansquenet's murder. She claimed she was at the Gaiety Theatre, then returned home to you. Can you confirm this?" Michael hesitated, running a hand through his tousled hair. "Well, yes, more or less. I was out late, meeting with a producer. When I got back, Rosamond was already home, asleep. She'd mentioned going to the Gaiety, though, said she needed inspiration." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "And what time did you return? Monsieur must have been midnight, maybe 1, Michael said, shifting uncomfortably. "Why? You don't think Rosamond had anything to do with Cora's death, do you? She's all nerves since Richard died, but she's no killer." Poirot smiled enigmatically. "I think only of the truth, monsieur. Tell me, did Rosamond speak of a letter Cora possessed? One concerning your Uncle Richard's death?" Michael's face tightened, and for a moment Poirot glimpsed something rougher, perhaps, or guilt. "A letter? No, she didn't mention anything like that. Cora was always full of wild ideas. If she had something, it was probably nonsense. Poirot nodded, but his mind was racing. Michael's unease suggested he knew more than he let on. As Poirot left the flat, he noticed a crumpled receipt on the floor, half hidden under a rug. He stooped to retrieve it, a train ticket from London to Cora's seaside village, dated the day of her murder, with Michael's name scrawled on it. Back at Enderby Hall, Poirot sought out Susan Banks, the sharp-witted niece who had grown close to Richard. He found her in the library, poring over old family albums. Her dark hair was pulled back, and her eyes held a quiet intensity that reminded Poirot of a chess player studying the board. "Mademoiselle Banks," Poirot began, "you mentioned a rumor about Richard's first wife, Helen, dying under odd circumstances. Can you tell me more?" Susan closed the album, her expression guarded. "It's just family gossip, really. Helen died 20 years ago, when I was a child. They said it was a heart attack, but Aunt Cora always hinted it was something else. She claimed Helen had found out something about Richard's business dealings, something dangerous. Cora was obsessed with it, especially after Richard's death." Poirot's mind clicked like a metronome. And did Cora ever mention a letter, one that might connect these deaths? Susan frowned, tapping her fingers on the album. "Not directly, but she did say something odd when I visited her last month. She was painting, as usual, and she muttered about proof hidden in plain sight. I thought she meant one of her canvases, but she wouldn't explain. Then she asked me to keep an eye on Rosamond and Michael. Said they were too ambitious, for their own good." Poirot's moustache twitched. "Most illuminating, mademoiselle. And one final question. Have you seen Rosamond with any unusual items? A letter, perhaps, or a small object from Cora's cottage?" Susan shook her head, but her eyes lingered on Poirot. "No, but I did notice Rosamond wearing a new brooch yesterday, shaped like a crescent moon, with a tiny sapphire. She said it was a gift, but she wouldn't say from whom." Poirot thanked her and retreated to his room, where he spread his notes across a desk. The pieces were aligning, but the picture remained blurred. Rosamond's lies, Michael's train ticket, Cora's letter, and now a mysterious brooch each was a thread in a tapestry of deceit. He recalled the paint smudge on Rosamond's coat and the leaf from the conservatory, ultramarine, a color Cora favored, but also one used in jewelry settings to enhance sapphires. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Lansquenet, the butler, his face pale and his hands trembling. "Monsieur Poirot, I must speak with you. It's about Miss Rosamond. I saw her in the garden last night after your meeting. She was burning something papers, I think, and she was muttering to herself something about no one must know." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Mercy, Lansquenet, others. You have done well. Tell me, did you see what these papers were?" Lansquenet shook his head. "No, sir, but there was a smell like ink and old paper, and she was wearing that moon brooch Miss Susan mentioned. It caught the light, like it was winking at me." Poirot dismissed Lansquenet with a nod. his mind now a whirlwind of connections. Rosamond, burning papers, a brooch shaped like a crescent moon, echoing the title of the play she'd seen, The Moonlit Betrayal, and Michael with a train ticket to Cora's village. The letter Cora claimed to possess was the key, but had Rosamond found it or destroyed it? That evening, Poirot orchestrated a small gathering in Enderby's drawing room, inviting Rosamond, Michael, and Susan. The fire crackled, casting long shadows across the oak-panelled walls. Rosamond wore the crescent moon brooch, its sapphire glinting like a cold eye. Michael sat beside her, his fingers drumming nervously on his knee. Susan watched them both, her expression unreadable. "Monsieur Poirot, this feels like a scene from one of Rosamond's plays," Michael said, forcing a laugh. "What's the occasion?" Poirot stood before the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back. "The occasion, monsieur, is truth, or rather, the absence of it. Mademoiselle Shane, you have told me many stories, but one remains untold. The story of the letter Cora offered you and what you did to obtain it." Rosamond's smile was brittle. "I've already explained, Monsieur Poirot. Cora mentioned a letter, but I never saw it. You're chasing shadows." Poirot produced the train ticket, holding it aloft. "And this, Monsieur Shane, a ticket to Cora's village on the day she died. You were not with the producer, were you? You followed your wife, perhaps, to insure her." Transaction with Cora went smoothly. Michael's face drained of color. That's nonsense. I bought that ticket for a different day, a scouting trip for my play. You've got it all wrong." Susan leaned forward, her voice sharp. "Then why lie, Michael? You told me you were in London all week. What were you doing in Cora's village?" Rosamond shot Michael a glance, a silent warning, but Poirot pressed on. "And the brooch, mademoiselle, a crescent moon, a gift, you say. But I suspect it was no gift. It was Cora's Nan, a keepsake you took from her cottage, perhaps as proof of your visitor, as a trophy." Rosamond's hand flew to the brooch, her fingers trembling. It's mine, bought in London months ago. You're grasping at straws, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot's voice softened, but his eyes were relentless. "Then let us test your story. Remove the brooch, mademoiselle, and show me its back. If it is yours, it will bear no mark of Cora, but if it is hers, I suspect we will find her initials etched in her own hand." The room was silent, save for the fire's crackle. Rosamond's eyes darted to Michael, then to Susan, then back to Poirot. Slowly, her hand fell from the brooch, and she arose, her voice barely a whisper. "You're clever, Monsieur Poirot. Too clever. Yes, it's Cora's brooch. I took it, but not for the reason you think. I went back to her cottage that night after the gaiety. She was alive when I left, I swear. The brooch was on her table, and I took it because she owed me. For all her manipulations, her games, I never saw any letter." Michael stood, his voice breaking. "Rosamond, stop. You don't have to," but Poirot raised a hand, silencing him. "Enough, monsieur. Your wife has spoken, and her words confirm much, but not all. The letter I believe, is still within your reach. And I, Hercule Poirot, will find it. As Rosamond sank back into her chair, her face a mask of defeat, Poirot turned to the fire, his mind already tracing the next thread. The brooch was a clue, but the letter was the prize. And somewhere in Enderby Hall, or in the shadows of Rosamond's lies, it waited to be found. The chapter closed with Poirot alone in his room, the leaf from the conservatory in one hand, the train ticket in the other. He placed them side by side, his grey cells humming. Rosamond's confession had cracked her facade, but the truth was deeper still. The paint, the brooch, the letter, they were pieces of a puzzle, and Poirot was determined to fit them together, no matter how many masks he had to unmask. Chapter 8. The hypochondriac's roost-the-rain had ceased its relentless assault on Enderby Hall, but the air inside the Gothic manor remained heavy, as if the walls themselves exhaled the weight of secrets. Hercule Poirot, his small frame impeccable, in a tailored suit, stood in the drawing-room, his moustache twitching as he surveyed the scene. The Abernethy family, gathered for yet another tense meal, cast furtive glances at one another, their faces a gallery of guarded expressions. Timothy Abernethy, the hypochondriac brother of the late Richard, held court from his wheelchair at the head of the table, his voice a querulous drone as he lamented his latest ailment. "My digestion, Poirot," Timothy wheezed, clutching a glass of water as if it were a lifeline. "It's in utter disarray. The cook's insistence on Rosemary's poison to my system, I tell you." His pale eyes, watery behind thick spectacles, darted to his wife, Maud, who sat beside him, her broad shoulders squared like a sentinel's. Maud, a woman whose stoic demeanor could rival a granite cliff, patted Timothy's hand with practiced patience. "Now, dear, you've had your tonic. Let's not trouble Monsieur Poirot with your complaints." Her voice was calm, but Poirot noted the faintest tightening of her lips, a crack in her otherwise unyielding facade. Poirot, seated across from Timothy, inclined his head politely. "Monsieur Abernethy, the rosemary. It is perhaps not to blame. The mind. It plays tricks when the heart is burdened. None." His tone was light, but his grey eyes, sharp as a falcon's, missed nothing. The other heirs, George, the gambling cousin, Susan, the keen-eyed niece, and the theatrical couple, Michael and Rosamond, shifted uncomfortably, their silverware clinking against porcelain in the strained silence. Dinner progressed with stilted conversations, the family tiptoeing around the spectre of Cora Lansquenet's murder and the lingering question of Richard's death. Poirot, however, was not here to partake in their charades. His purpose was singular, to unmask the truth, and Timothy, with his endless ailments and theatrical suffering, had piqued the detective's curiosity. There was something performative in the man's frailty, a dissonance that Poirot's orderly mind could not ignore. As the meal concluded, Poirot excused himself, citing a need for fresh air. Instead, he slipped into the corridor leading to Timothy's ground-floor bedroom, a room Maud had insisted upon to accommodate his delicate conditions. The door was ajar, and Poirot paused, his ears attuned to the faint creak of floorboards. Within, he nudged the door open, revealing Timothy's sanctuary, a dimly lit chamber cluttered with medical paraphernalia, vials, syringes, and a stack of well-thumbed medical journals. The wheelchair stood empty by the bed, its leather seat gleaming faintly in the lamplight. Poirot's lips pursed. "Curio," he murmured. He had seen Timothy wheeled into the dining room not an hour ago. Where, then, was the invalid now? A soft thud from the adjoining bathroom drew his attention. Poirot moved silently, his polished shoes making no sound on the Persian rug. He reached the bathroom door, which was slightly open, and peered inside. There, standing at the sink, was Timothy Abernethy, his back to Poirot. The man was rinsing a glass, his movements brisk and steady, hardly the actions of a frail invalid. Poirot's eyes narrowed as Timothy, unaware of his observer, stretched his arms above his head, a gesture of vigor that belied his public persona. Before Poirot could announce himself, Timothy turned, catching sight of the detective in the mirror. His face blanched, and he stumbled backward, clutching the sink for support. "Poirot, what are you doing here?" His voice cracked, and he sank onto a stool, his hands trembling theatrically. "Monsieur Abernethy," Poirot said, stepping into the room, "I am merely ensuring your well-being. You appear remarkably agile for a man so afflicted." His tone was gentle, but the accusation hung in the air like smoke. Timothy's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment before he rallied. I have moments of strength, Poirot. The pain, it comes and goes. You wouldn't understand." He reached for a bottle of pills on the counter. Fumbling with the cap, Poirot's gaze flicked to the bottle, noting the label, a common antacid, not the potent medication Timothy claimed to require. "Perhaps," Poirot said, "but the little gray cells, they are curious. They wonder why a man who cannot walk at dinner stands so freely in private." Timothy's eyes widened, and he opened his mouth to protest, but Poirot held up a hand. Nan, do not trouble yourself with explanations. I will return later, perhaps, to discuss your recovery." With a slight bow he retreated, leaving Timothy staring after him, his face a mask of panic. Back in the corridor, Poirot's mind churned. Timothy's deception was clear, but to what end? Was it merely to garner sympathy, to secure a larger share of Richard's fortunes? Or did it conceal a darker purpose, one tied to Cora's hatchet-murdered corpse, or Richard's untimely death? Poirot resolved to test his hypothesis, to catch Timothy in a moment of unguarded truth. The opportunity came later that evening, in the library where the family had gathered for coffee. The room, with its towering bookshelves and flickering firelight, felt like a stage set for a drama. Poirot, sipping an espresso, positioned himself near the hearth, where he could observe Timothy, who was once again ensconced in his wheelchair, a shawl draped over his knees. Maud hovered nearby, her eyes darting between her husband and the other heirs, as if anticipating a threat. Poirot waited until the conversation turned to Richard's will, a topic that never failed to ignite tension. "Susan," her voice cool and precise, remarked, Uncle Richard always said he'd provide for those who deserved it. I wonder what he'd think of us now, squabbling like vultures. George, nursing a brandy, snorted. Deserved it. He played favorites, Susan, and you know it. If he'd lived longer, he'd have cut us all out. Timothy, seizing the moment, clutched his chest dramatically. Oh, my heart. The stress of this talk, it's too much. He slumped in his chair, his breathing labored, drawing all eyes to him. Maud rushed to his side, producing a vial of smelling salts with the speed of a conjurer. Poirot saw his chance. With a deliberate flick of his wrist, he accidentally knocked a crystal tumbler from the mantel, sending it plummeting toward the floor. The room froze, and Timothy, caught off guard, lunged forward, his hand darting out to catch the glass before it shattered. The tumbler landed safely in his palm, and for a moment silence reigned, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Timothy froze, realizing his error. Poirot, his expression one of mild surprise, stepped forward. Mon Dieu, Monsieur Abernethy, what a remarkable reflex. For a man so frail, you possess the agility of a panther. The heirs stared, their faces a mix of shock and suspicion. Maud's jaw tightened, and she stepped between Poirot and her husband. Monsieur Poirot, that was cruel. Timothy acts on instinct, despite his pain. You've upset him terribly. Poirot inclined his head, his eyes never leaving Timothy's. My apologies, madame. I meant only to admire his quickness. It is, perhaps, a talent he has kept hidden too long. He turned away, but not before noting the fear in Timothy's eyes, a fear that spoke of more than mere embarrassment. As the family dispersed, Poirot lingered in the library, his mind piecing together the puzzle. Timothy's ruse was no mere eccentricity. It was a calculated act designed to deflect scrutiny. But from what? Poirot's thoughts drifted to Cora's murder, to the muddy footprint at her cottage, and to the extra bottle of digitalis found in Richard's room. Could Timothy, with his feigned helplessness, have orchestrated such crimes, or was he a pawn, manipulated by another? Determined to uncover the truth, Poirot waited until the house grew quiet. The only sounds, the creak of settling timbers and the distant hoot of an owl. Clad in a dark overcoat, he made his way to Timothy's bedroom, his steps silent on the polished floors. The door was locked, but Poirot, ever resourceful, produced a small tool from his Paqueta gift from a locksmith friend in Brussels, and coaxed the lock open with a soft click. The room was dark, save for a sliver of moonlight filtering through the curtains. Timothy lay in bed, his breathing steady, but Poirot's instincts told him the man was not asleep. Moving swiftly, he began a methodical search, his gloved hands probing drawers and shelves. In a locked box beneath the bed, he found what he sought, a small glass vial, its label reading digitalis. The discovery sent a chill through him. Digitalis, the drug linked to Richard's death, hidden in the room of a man who claimed to be too weak to harm a fly. Poirot pocketed the vial, intending to confront Timothy at dawn, but as he turned to leave, a floorboard creaked behind him. He spun, his hand on his cane, to find Maud standing in the doorway, her face pale in the moonlight. She held a candlestick, its flame casting eerie shadows on the walls. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice low and dangerous, "you should not be here." Poirot met her gaze, his composure unshaken. "Madame Abernethy, it is you who should explain. This vial," he held it up, the glass glinting. "It tells a story, does it not?" Maud's eyes widened, and for a moment Poirot thought she might lunge at him. Instead, she lowered the candlestick, her shoulders sagging. "You don't understand," she whispered. "I did it for him, for Timothy. He's all I have." Poirot's mind raced. Was Maud confessing to protecting Timothy's secret, or to something far graver? Before he could press her, a groan came from the bed, and Timothy sat up, his eyes wild. "Maud, no, don't say another word." The room, Prize, seemed to shrink, the air thick with unspoken truths. Poirot stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. "Monsieur and Madame Abernethy, the time for games is over. The little grey cells, they have seen through your performance. Now, you will tell me the truth, Thor. I shall summon the police." Maud's face crumpled, and she sank into a chair, her candlestick clattering to the floor. Timothy, his facade crumbling, buried his face in his hands. Poirot stood between them, the vial of digitalis in his hand, a silent witness to the unraveling of their carefully crafted lie. The night stretched on, and as Poirot listened to their halting explanations, a picture began to form, a picture of desperation, loyalty, and a crime that had spiraled beyond their control. Timothy's ruse, it seemed, was not merely to deceive the family, but to shield a deeper secret, one Maud had fought to protect at any cost. The vial of digitalis, hidden in plain sight, was the key, but to what lock? As dawn broke over Enderby Hall, Poirot left the room, his mind ablaze with possibilities. Timothy's deception had been exposed, but the true architect of the murders remained elusive. Maud's fierce loyalty hinted at her involvement, but Poirot sensed there was more to uncover, threads connecting Richard's death, Cora's murder, Pand, the digitalis that seemed to haunt this cursed family. He paused in the corridor, the vial heavy in his pocket. The heirs would gather again at breakfast, their faces masks of innocence or guilt. Poirot would be watching his little grey cells, poised to strike. The hypochondriac's ruse had unraveled, but the game was far from over. Chapter 9. The solicitors doubt the rain had stopped, but Enderby Hall seemed to hold its breath under a shroud of mist that clung to its ancient stones. Hercule Poirot stood at the tall, arched window of the library, his gloved hands clasped behind his back, his sharp eyes scanning the sodden gardens below. The manicured hedges, now blurred by the fog, seemed to whisper secrets of their own, as if they too were complicit in the Abernethy family's tangled web of greed and deceit. The air inside was heavy with the scent of old leather books and beeswax polish, but to Poirot it carried something else, a faint tense of fear. He turned as the door creaked open, revealing Mr. Entwistle, the family solicitor, his face etched with the strain of the past few days. The elderly man's spectacles glinted under the chandelier's dim light, and his hands trembled slightly as he clutched a worn leather portfolio. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice low, almost conspiratorial, "I must speak with you. Alone." Poirot gestured to a pair of her-backed chairs by the fireplace, where a few embers glowed feebly. "Maize beans, sir, Monsieur Entwistle. The solitude of this room is most conducive to the truths that hide in shadows. Pray, sit and unburden your mind." Entwistle sank into the chair, his portfolio resting on his lap like a shield. He glanced at the door, ensuring it was firmly shut before leaning forward. "I've known the Abernethys for decades," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Richard was a friend, not just a client, a man of principle, though not without his flaws. But in the weeks before his death, he was troubled. He spoke of distrust, of feeling watched, even in his own home." Poirot's moustache twitched, a subtle sign of his piqued interest. "Distrust, you say? Of whom did he speak?" Entwistle hesitated, his fingers tightening on the portfolio. "His heirs, all of them. He said they were circling like vultures, waiting for him to die. He even mentioned rewriting his will to protect someone, but he never told me who." Poirot's eyes narrowed, their green glint catching the firelight. "A new will, monsieur. This is most intriguing. Was such a document drafted?" Entwistle nodded, fumbling with the portfolio's clasp. "Yes, but it was never signed. Richard died before he could finalize it. I have it here." He extracted a sheaf of papers, their edges yellowed, and handed them to Poirot. "It's incomplete, but it favored one heir above the others, Suzanne Banks, his niece." Poirot scanned the document, his lips pursing as he read. The unsigned will left the bulk of Richard's estate to Susan, with only modest sums for Timothy, George, Michael, and Rosamond. A clause caught his eye, a provision for Enderby Hall to be maintained as a trust, with Susan as its steward. "Mon Dieu," Poirot murmured, "this would have changed everything." "Why did Richard favor Mademoiselle Suzanne?" Entwistle sighed, rubbing his temples. "He saw her as the only one untainted by greed. Susan is clever, practical, not swayed by the family's excesses. Richard confided that he believed she could preserve his legacy. But the others, they would have been furious." Poirot leaned back, his fingers steepled. "And this draft, it was known to the family?" "No," Entwistle said quickly. "Only to me and Richard. I kept it locked in my office in London." But his voice faltered, and he glanced at the door again. "Last night I heard footsteps outside my room here at Enderby, and this morning my briefcase was disturbed papers, slightly out of order. Someone is searching for something." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "You suspect an attempt to steal this will?" Entwistle nodded grimly. "Or to destroy it. If the new will surfaced, it would append their expectations. Timothy, George, Michael, Rosamond, they all stand to lose. Even Maud, who seems so devoted to Timothy, might act to protect his share." Poirot rose, pacing the room with the deliberate grace of a cat. This is a puzzle most delicate, a will that changes fortunes, a patriarch's distrust, and now a prowler in the night. We must act, Monsieur Entwistle, before the hunter becomes the hunted. I propose a trap." Entwistle blinked, startled. "A trap? What do you mean?" Poirot smiled, a gleam of mischief in his eyes. "We shall let it be known discreetly, of course, that you intend to reveal the new will tomorrow. Rewatch, and the one who moves to silence it will reveal themselves. But we must be vigilant. The heart that plots murder does not sleep." Entwistle swallowed hard, his face bulging. "Very well, Monsieur Poirot, but I fear we're stirring." "A hornet's nest," Bon Poirot said, clapping his hands. "The hornets, they will come, and Hercule Poirot will be ready." The day unfolded with a deceptive calm. Enderby Hall buzzed with the quiet tension of a household under siege, its inhabitants moving like pieces on a chessboard. Poirot, ever the observer, noted the subtle shifts in behavior. Timothy, ensconced in his wheelchair, complained loudly of a headache, his voice carrying through the drawing-room. Maud hovered near him, her eyes darting to Poirot with a guarded intensity. George, freshly returned from London, fidgeted with his cufflinks, his face flushed as if from a sleepless night. Michael and Rosamond, the theatrical couple, rehearsed lines in the conservatory, their laughter too bright, too forced. Susan, meanwhile, kept to the library, poring over old family albums, her expression unreadable. Poirot orchestrated the trap with precision. At luncheon, he casually mentioned to Lansquenet, the butler, that Entwistle had important documents to discuss with the family tomorrow. Lansquenet, ever discreet, nodded, but Poirot knew the whisper would spread. Servants, he mused, were the veins of a great house, carrying secrets to every corner. By evening, the trap was set. Entwistle agreed to leave his portfolio in his room, unlocked. With a decoy documenter forged will with Susan's name prominently featured, Poirot rigged a simple mechanism, a thin thread tied to the portfolio's clasp, leading to a bell, hidden beneath the floorboards. If anyone tampered with it, the bell would chime in Poirot's room, 2 doors down. As night fell, Enderby Hall grew silent, its corridors cloaked in shadow. Poirot sat in his room, a single candle flickering on the table, his ears attuned to the faintest sound. The clock struck 11, then midnight. The house seemed to settle, its creaks and groans blending into a restless lullaby. Poirot's eyes never wavered from the door, his mind replaying the day's observations. Who, he wondered, would take the bait? At 1:30, a faint chime broke the silence. Poirot sprang to his feet, his heart quickening. The bell. He slipped on his velvet dressing-gown, pocketed a small flashlight, and crept into the corridor. The air was cool, heavy with a scent of wax and dust. He moved soundlessly, his patent leather shoes muffled by the thick carpet. And room was at the end of the hall, its door slightly ajar. Poirot paused, listening. A soft rustle came from within, followed by the creak of a floorboard. He eased the door open, his flashlight casting a narrow beam across the room. The portfolio lay open on the desk, its contents scattered. A figure stood by the window, cloaked in darkness, their back to Poirot. The decoy will was in their hand. "Bonsoir," Poirot said softly, his voice cutting through the stillness. "It is a late hour for reading, Nan." The figure froze, then turned slowly. The flashlight's beam caught the glint of Michael's eyes, wide with panic. His handsome face, usually so composed, was a mask of fear. "Poirot," he stammered, clutching the paper. This isn't what it looks like." Poirot stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "And what does it look like, Monsieur Michael? A man stealing in the night, rifling through private documents? Or perhaps a man desperate to protect his wife's inheritance?" Michael's shoulders sagged, the paper slipping from his fingers. "I wasn't stealing. I needed to know. Rosamond's been so worried ever since Cora's murder. She said if there was a new will, it could ruin us. Our play, our all we have." Poirot tilted his head, studying him. "And so you break into Monsieur Entwistle's room. You risk everything for a piece of paper." Michael ran a hand through his hair, his voice cracking. "I had to protect her, Rosamond. Fragile, Poirot. You don't know what this family's done to her. Richard, he promised us money for the theatre, then changed his mind. I thought maybe he'd cut us out entirely." Poirot's eyes softened, but his tone remained firm. "And this will... It tells you what you fear." Michael hesitated, glancing at the scattered papers. "It names Susan as the main heir. We'd get almost nothing. Rosamond would be devastated." Poirot retrieved the decoy will, folding it neatly. "This document, monsieur, is a fiction, a trap set by Poirot to catch a thief. But you have revealed more than you intended." Michael's face drained of color. "A trap, you mean? It's not real." Poirot shook his head. "None. But your actions, they are very real. Tell me, Monsieur Michael, where were you the day Richard died?" Michael recoiled, his voice rising. "What, you think I am?" "I was in London, rehearsing." "Ask Rosamond." Poirot held up a hand, silencing him. "And yet you visited Richard that day, did you not? Lanscombe saw a man matching your description, leaving Enderby in haste." Michael's eyes darted to the door, as if contemplating flight. Then, with a shudder, he sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. "All right," he whispered. "I saw him. I went to beg for money, for the play. He refused. Said I was a fool to think he'd fund our nonsense. We argued, but I swear I left him alive." Poirot watched him closely, his mind racing. Michael's confession fit the timeline, but something in his demeanor or unguarded suggested truth. Or was it another performance? "And Cora," Poirot pressed. "Did you visit her to silence her suspicions?" Michael's head snapped up, his eyes blazing. "No. I barely knew Cora. She was a mad old bat, always painting, always talking nonsense. I had nothing to do with her death." Poirot nodded slowly, filing away the outburst. "Very well, monsieur. But there is one more thing." He reached into his pocket, producing a folded letter. "This was found in your room, hidden in a book. It is from Cora, is it not? Michael's breath caught, his hands trembling. Where did you? Poirot unfolded the letter, reading aloud. Michael, beware the family's greed. Richard's death was no accident. Trust no one. Why did Cora write to you? Michael stared at the floor, his voice barely audible. She sent it a week before she died. I didn't know what to make of it. I thought she was delusional, raving about conspiracies. I hid it because I didn't want Rosamond to see it. She's already so afraid. Poirot folded the letter, slipping it back into his pocket. You will say nothing of this, Monsieur Michael, not to your wife, not to the others. Poirot will decide what is to be done. Michael nodded, his face ashen. I swear, Poirot, I'm no murderer. Poirot turned to leave, pausing at the door. Perhaps not, but the night, this long and the truth, it hides in the darkest corners. The next morning, Enderby Hall awoke to a strained breakfast. The heirs gathered in the dining room, their faces a gallery of unease. Timothy grumbled about his porridge. Maud cut his toast with surgical precision, and George avoided eye contact, his fingers drumming on the table. Rosamond, pale and silent, clung to Michael's arm, while Susan watched them all with a quiet intensity. Poirot joined them, his demeanor serene but his eyes alert. He noted the empty chair where Entwistle should have sat. Moments later, the solicitor appeared, his face grim. Monsieur Poirot, he said, drawing him aside, there's been an incident. My office in London was broken into last night. Nothing was taken, but my files on the Abernethys were disturbed. Poirot's moustache quivered. Most interesting. And you are certain it was last night? Entwistle nodded. My clerk telephoned this morning. The lock was forced, but the thief left empty. Poirot glanced at Michael, who was buttering his toast with exaggerated care. Had he acted alone, or was another heir involved? The break-in suggested desperation, a move to erase evidence beyond Enderby's walls. But who had the means to orchestrate it from afar? As breakfast ended, Poirot slipped into the library, where Susan was arranging flowers in a vase. Mademoiselle, he said, closing the door, a word, if you please. Susan turned, her dark eyes meeting his. Of course, Monsieur Poirot. What is it? Poirot studied her, noting the steadiness of her gaze. You are close to your Uncle Richard, Nan. Did he ever speak of changing his will? Susan's fingers paused on a rose stem. He hinted at it, yes. He said he wanted to ensure Enderby's future. I assumed he meant for all of us, but he was fond of me. He said I reminded him of his first wife. Poirot's eyebrows rose. His first wife, whose death was, perhaps, not so natural. Susan's lips tightened. That's a family rumor, nothing more. But Richard was cautious in his final weeks. He kept his study locked, even from Lanscombe. I thought it odd. Poirot nodded, his mind turning to the hidden room he had yet to explore. And this will, if it favored you, would it cause resentment? Susan sighed, setting the vase down. Resentment. It would cause a war. Timothy's pride, George's debts, Michael and Rosamond's dreams, they all depend on Richard's money. Even Maud, for all her loyalty, would fight. For Timothy's share, Poirot smiled faintly. You are perceptive, mademoiselle, but perception can be dangerous. Be careful, I beg you. As he left the library, Poirot's thoughts churned. The unsigned will, Michael's confession, the break-in, Susan's candor-rich piece fit into a larger mosaic, but the image remained blurred. He resolved to search Enderby's hidden corners, starting with Richard's study. But first, he would tighten the trap. That afternoon, Poirot gathered the heirs in the drawing-room, Entwistle at his side. Mise Amos, he began, his voice smooth as silk. Monsieur Entwistle has something to share, a matter of great importance. Entwistle cleared his throat, holding up a sealed envelope. This is a copy of Richard's final will, drafted but unsigned. Tomorrow I will present it to the authorities, as it may shed light on recent events. The room erupted in murmurs. Timothy's face reddened, George's hands clenched, and Rosamond gripped Michael's arm. Maud's eyes narrowed, her lips a thin line. Susan alone remained calm, her gaze fixed on Poirot. As the heirs dispersed, Poirot watched them go, his mind alight with possibilities. The trap was sprung, and the hunter would move tonight. But who would it be, and what would they risk to keep? Their secrets buried. The night was moonless, the mist thicker than ever. Poirot sat in Richard's study, a single lamp casting long shadows across the oak-panelled walls. He had found the study locked, as Susan described, but Lansquenet, with a reluctant sigh, had provided the key. The room was a time capsule, a mahogany desk cluttered with papers, a globe spun to show Belgium, and a portrait of Richard's first wife, her eyes hauntingly familiar. Poirot searched methodically, his gloved fingers tracing the desk's edges. A false drawer yielded a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. They were addressed to E, the same initial from the Hidden Room's correspondence. Poirot read one, his breath catching. "My dearest E," it began, "I fear I've wronged you. The family's greed consumes us all. Forgive me." The signature was Richard's, dated a month before his death. A noise at the window snapped Poirot from his thoughts. He doused the lamp, slipping behind a heavy curtain. The window creaked open, and a figure climbed through, their silhouette lit by a distant lightning flash. Poirot waited, his heart steady, as the intruder approached the desk. The figure paused, rifling through the papers. Poirot stepped forward, his flashlight blazing. "Bonsoir," he said, his voice icy. "You are most persistent, Madame Maud." Maud froze, her hand clutching a letter. Her face, usually so composed, was a mask of fury. "Poirot," she hissed, "you meddle where you're not wanted." Poirot smiled, undeterred. "And you, madame, seek what does not belong to you. Those letters, they tell a story, Nan, of betrayal, of a family torn apart." Maud's eyes burned. "You know nothing." Richard was weak, swayed by Susan's flattery. Timothy deserved more. I did what I had to. Poirot's gaze hardened. And what was that, madame? Poison Richard with digitalis. Silence Cora with a hatchet. Maud laughed. A brittle sound. You're clever, Poirot, but you have no proof. Those letters mean nothing without context. Poirot stepped closer, his voice low. Perhaps, but the footprint at Cora's cottage, it matches your boots. And the digitalis vial in Timothy's room you're doing. I presume. Maud's composure cracked, her hand trembling. You can't prove it, she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. Poirot shook his head. Hercule Poirot does not need proof to see the truth. You will come with me, madame, or the police will come for you. As Maud slumped, defeated, Poirot knew the case was nearing its end. But the letters, the will, and Susan's role still held secrets. The night was not over, and Enderby Hall's shadows had more to reveal. Chapter 10. The Midnight Intruder. The moon hung low over Enderby Hall, its pale light seeping through the tall windows of the library, casting long shadows across the oak-panelled walls. Hercule Poirot stood motionless by the fireplace, his small, precise hands clasped behind his back, his moustache twitching ever so slightly as he listened to the silence of the house. The clock on the mantel ticked toward midnight, each second a deliberate step toward the trap he had set. Tonight, he was certain, the intruder would come. The library was a cavern of secrets, its shelves groaning under the weight of leather-bound tomes, their spines cracked with age. Earlier that day, Poirot had instructed Mr. Entwistle, the family solicitor, to let slip a tantalizing rumor during tea. The unsigned will, the one that favored Susan Banks over the other Abernethy heirs, was locked in Entwistle's office, safe, unguarded. It was a lie. Of course, the will was safely tucked in Poirot's own valise, hidden in his room, but the bait was irresistible. Greed, Poirot knew, was a restless beast, and someone in this fractured family would rise to snatch it. He had chosen the library as his vantage point, a strategic perch overlooking the corridor leading to Entwistle's office. The door was ajar, just enough to afford him a clear view without betraying his presence. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, scanned the darkness beyond. The house was still, but not asleep. Enderby never truly slept. It creaked and whispered, as if the walls themselves mourned Richard Abernethy's death or guarded his secrets. Poirot's mind churned, replaying the day's events. The heirs had been restless, their civility fraying like a worn tapestry. Timothy Abernethy, the hypochondriac brother, had complained incessantly about his heart palpitations. Though Poirot had caught him standing unaided that morning, his wheelchair abandoned for a fleeting moment. George Crossfield, the gambling cousin, had returned from London with a pallor that spoke of debts unpaid. Rosamond Shane, the actress, had flitted about with her practiced charm. But Poirot had seen the paint smudge on her coat a hue, matching Cora Lansquenet's art supplies. And Michael, her husband, had been oddly subdued, his usual swagger dimmed by some unspoken weight. Then there was Susan Banks, the quiet niece, whose sharp eyes missed nothing. She had shown Poirot the locket that afternoon, a gift from Richard containing a photograph of his first wife, Helen. He always said her death wasn't an accident, Susan had whispered, her voice trembling. He thought someone in the family knew more than they let on. The locket had stirred something in Poirot, a connection, faint but insistent, between Helen's death decades ago and the digitalis found in Richard's room. 2 deaths, 2 doses of poison, separated by years but bound by motive. A soft creak snapped Poirot from his thoughts. It came from the corridor, a cautious footfall on the polished floor. He pressed himself against the wall, his breath steady, his heart a metronome. The shadow of a figure appeared, elongated and wavering in the moonlight. The intruder moved with purpose, pausing at the door to Entwistle's office. A faint metallic clink followed the sound of a key, perhaps, or a tool probing the lock. Poirot slipped from the library, his patent leather shoes silent on the rug. He reached the corridor just as the office door eased open. The intruder stepped inside, unaware of the detective's approach. Poirot paused at the threshold, peering into the dimly lit room. The safe stood against the far wall, its iron face gleaming under the flicker of a pocket torch held by the figure. The beam danced across the dials, revealing the intruder's hand, slender, gloved, and trembling slightly. "Monsieur Poirot," said softly, his voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "The safe, it is empty. I regret to inform you." The figure froze, the torch clattering to the floor. It rolled across the rug, casting wild shadows as it came to rest. Poirot stepped forward, his silhouette framed in the doorway. The intruder turned, and the moonlight caught his face. Michael Shane, Rosamond's husband, his handsome features twisted with panic. "Poirot," Michael gasped, his voice a hoarse whisper. "What the devil are you doing here?" "It is I who should ask that question, Monsieur Shane," Poirot replied, his tone calm but laced with steel. He bent to retrieve the torch, switching it off with a click. "You are far from your bed at this hour, and with such interesting intentions." Michael's shoulders sagged, but his eyes darted toward the door, as if calculating his escape. Poirot moved to block the exit, his small frame surprisingly imposing. "Do not think to run, monsieur. The truth, it is a better companion tonight." Michael ran a gloved hand through his hair, his composure cracking. All right. I was looking for the will, the new one Entwistle mentioned. I thought if I could see it, I could protect Rosamond's share. She deserves her part, Poirot. We both do." Poirot tilted his head, his mustache quivering as he studied Michael's face. "Protect, you say, or perhaps ensure. The difference, it is significant. Tell me, why such urgency? The will, it is not yet probated. Why risk discovery in the dead of night?" Michael hesitated, his jaw tightening. Because someone's trying to cut us out." Rosamond heard Susan talking to Entwistle about Richard favoring her. "If that will's real, we'll get nothing. We're drowning, Poirot. The theater's bleeding money, and our last play flopped. We need that inheritance." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And so you thought to steal the will?" to destroy it, perhaps? Or is there more to your nocturnal adventure? Speak, monsieur, for the night grows short. Michael's gaze dropped to the floor, his hands clenching into fists. I didn't want to steal it, just read it, to know where we stand. Rosamond's been frantic, and I can't bear to see her like this. She's everything to me. Poirot stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. And yet, Monsieur Cheyne, I suspect you are not entirely truthful. The gloves, the lockpick, these are the tools of a man with plans beyond mere reading. Perhaps you sought to alter the will, or to find something else in this office, something that connects to the deaths of Richard and Cora. Michael's head snapped up, his eyes wide. What? No. I had nothing to do with their deaths. I swear it. Then why? Poirot pressed. Do I find you here, creeping like a thief? And why, monsieur, did you visit Richard Abernethy the day he died? The question hung in the air, heavy as the shadows around them. Michael's face drained of color, his breath catching. How did you know? That Poirot's lips curved into a faint smile, though his eyes remained cold. The little grey cells, they do not sleep. Lansquenet, the butler, saw a man, matching your description, leaving Enderby that afternoon. You were not invited, yet you came. Why? Michael stumbled back, colliding with the desk. Papers scattered to the floor, their rustle loud in the tense silence. I went to ask for a loan, just a small one, to keep the theatre afloat. Richard refused. He said we were leeches, all of us, living off his fortune. He was furious. Poirot, I left him alive, I swear. Poirot picked up a fallen paper, glancing at it briefly before setting it aside. And yet Monsieur Richard died that night, and Cora, who suspected murder, was silenced the next day. You see how this appears, do you not? A man in debt, a man refused, a man with opportunity. Michael shook his head violently. No, I didn't kill them. I couldn't. Cora was kind to us. She was kind to us. She lent Rosamond money once, when we were desperate. Why would I hurt her? Poirot's gaze softened, but only slightly, perhaps to silence her. Cora, she was not discreet. Her words at the funeral, they stirred the hornet's nest. Did she know something about you, monsieur? Something you feared she would reveal? Michael's eyes filled with tears, and he sank into a chair, his gloves falling to the floor. She wrote to me a letter a week before Richard died. It arrived the day after the funeral. She said to beware the family's greed, that someone was planning something terrible. I thought she was mad, raving about conspiracies. But then she was killed, and I panicked. Poirot's mustache twitched, his interest piqued. A letter, you say? Where is this letter now? Michael hesitated, then reached into his coat, producing a crumpled envelope. I kept it. I don't know why. Maybe I thought it was proof I didn't do anything. Poirot took the envelope, his fingers deft as he extracted the letter. The paper was cheap, the handwriting hurried, but unmistakably Cora's. He read aloud, his voice measured. Dear Michael, You and Rosamond must be careful. The family is rotten with greed, and Richard's death is no accident. Someone plans to take it all. Beware, for they watch you too, Cora." Poirot folded the letter, slipping it into his pocket. "This, monsieur, is most illuminating. Why did you not show this to me before?" "Because I thought it made me look guilty," Michael burst out. "I was at Enderby that day. I argued with Richard, and now Cora's dead, and you're looking at me like I'm the killer. I'm not, Poirot. I'm not." Poirot regarded him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Perhaps, monsieur, perhaps not. But tonight you have given me much to consider. Return to your room, and speak of this to no one. The trap, it has caught its prey, but the hunt is not yet over." Michael nodded, his face a mask of exhaustion. "Pay." He rose unsteadily, pausing at the door. "Poirot, will you tell Rosamond?" "Not yet," Poirot replied. "But the truth, it will find its way, as always." As Michael's footsteps faded down the corridor, Poirot remained in the office, his mind racing. The letter was a revelation, proof that Cora had sensed a conspiracy before her death. But who was the someone she feared? Maud, the stoic, white, hiding her husband's secrets. George, the gambler, desperate enough to kill. Or Susan, whose quiet demeanor masked a mind as sharp as Poirot's own. He moved to the safe, his fingers brushing its cold surface. The lie had worked, drawing Michael out, but it had also exposed a deeper truth. The heirs were not merely greedy, but terrified. Someone among them knew more than they dared admit, and Poirot was determined to unmask them. The clock struck 1, its chime echoing through the house. Poirot extinguished the lamp and stepped into the corridor, his small figure swallowed by the darkness. As he made his way to his room, a faint sound reached his ears, a whisper, perhaps, or the rustle of fabric. He paused, his hand on the banister, but the sound did not come again. "Enderby," he murmured, "you keep your secrets well, but not from Hercule Poirot." The next morning, Enderby Hall buzzed with tension. Breakfast was a strained affair, the heirs avoiding each other's gazes as they picked at their toast and eggs. Poirot, seated at the head of the table, sipped his tisane with deliberate calm, his eyes flicking from face to face. Michael was pale, his hands unsteady as he buttered his bread. Rosamond beside him seemed oblivious, chattering about a new play she'd read. Timothy grumbled about the damp weather, aggravating his joints, while Maud cut his bacon with a precision that bordered on menacing. George was absent, having claimed a headache, and Susan watched them all with her usual quiet intensity. Joined them late, his face drawn. "I trust everyone slept well?" he asked, though his tone suggested he knew otherwise. "Passably," Poirot replied, setting down his cup, though the night it was not without incident. The table fell, silent, forks pausing mid-air. Rosamond's smile faltered. "Incident? What do you mean, Monsieur Poirot?" Poirot dabbed his lips with a napkin, savoring the moment. A small matter of curiosity. Someone, it seems, was eager to explore Monsieur Entwistle's office last night. A most illuminating discovery. Michael choked on his tea, coughing violently. Rosamond patted his back, her eyes darting to Poirot. "Who was it?" she demanded. "What were they after?" Poirot's smile was enigmatic. "Patience, Madame Shane. The truth, it reveals itself in time. But rest assured, the little grey cells, they are at work." Timothy slammed his knife down, his face red. "This is intolerable. Skulking about, accusing us all. What are you playing at, Poirot? If you know something, out with it." Maud placed a restraining hand on her husband's arm. "Timothy, please. Monsieur Poirot is only doing his job." "His job?" Timothy scoffed. "Stirring up trouble, more like. Richard died of a heart attack, and Corwell. She was always a fool, saying things she shouldn't. There's no murder here, just a meddling detective." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "And yet, Monsieur Abernethy, you are so certain. Why? I wonder, do you protest so loudly?" Timothy sputtered, but Maud intervened. "Enough. We're all tired, Monsieur Poirot. Perhaps you could share your findings privately with Mr. Entwistle." Poirot inclined his head. "A wise suggestion, Madame. Monsieur Entwistle, shall we?" The two men retreated to the library, leaving the heirs to their uneasy murmurs. Entwistle closed the door, his expression grave. "You caught someone last night, didn't you? Who was it?" Poirot produced Cora's letter, laying it on the table. "Michael Shane. He sought the will, claiming to protect his wife's share. But this letter, it suggests a deeper motive. Cora warned him of a plot within the family. She knew too much, and so she died." Entwistle read the letter, his hands trembling. "My God, this changes everything." "Do you think, Michael?" Poirot shook his head. "He is frightened, not guilty. But his visit to Richard, it troubles me. He admits to an argument, yet Richard died hours later. And the convenient Nan." Entwistle sank into a chair. "What now? If Michael's not the killer, who is?" Poirot's gaze drifted to the window, where the gardens lay shrouded in mist. "We must look to the past, Monsieur. Richard's first wife. Helen, her death is the key. Susan believes it was murder, and I begin to agree. The digitalis, the locket, the letters from E. They point to a secret buried deep in this family. We must dig, and quickly, before the killer strikes again." Entwistle nodded, his resolve hardening. "What do you need from me?" "Access to Richard's old correspondence," Poirot said, "and a list of all visitors to Enderby in the month before his death. The truth, it hides in the details." As Entwistle left to gather the documents, Poirot lingered in the library, his fingers tracing the spine of a book on the shelf. It was a volume of Greek mythology, open to a passage about the Hydra beast that grew 2 heads for each one cut off. Poirot smiled grimly. This case, too, was a Hydra, its secrets multiplying with each revelation. But he was no ordinary hero. He was Hercule Poirot, and no monster could outwit his little grey cells. The day unfolded with a restless energy, the heirs scattering to their corners of the house like chess pieces awaiting their next move. Poirot spent the afternoon in Richard's study, poring over letters and ledgers, his mind piecing together a mosaic of motive and opportunity. The correspondence revealed little at first: business dealings, charitable donations, the occasional note from a friend. But one letter, tucked inside a ledger, caught his eye. It was from Helen Abernethy, written a year before her death, and addressed to Richard. "My darling, I fear I've stumbled upon something dreadful. Timothy is not what he seems. He speaks of money as if it's his due, and I've seen him put that woman again. I don't trust her, Richard. Promise me you'll protect Susan if anything happens to me. Yours forever, Helen." Poirot's pulse quickened. Timothy and a woman. Could it be Maud, or someone else, long forgotten? The letter was a thread, fragile but vital, leading back to Helen's death. He slipped it into his pocket, determined prior to confront Timothy. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Poirot watched Timothy closely. The man was in rare form, railing against the cook's choice of soup, as if it were a personal affront. Maud, as always, hovered at his side, her face a mask of patience. But Poirot noticed something new, a faint tremor in her hand as she passed the salt, a flicker of unease in her eyes when they met his dot after dinner. Poirot found Timothy alone in the drawing-room, a glass of brandy in his hand. "Monsieur Abernethy," Poirot began, "a word, if you please." Timothy scowled. "What now, Poirot?" Another accusation. Poirot produced Helen's letter, holding it just out of reach. "This letter, it speaks of you, of your ambition, shall we say, and a woman. Tell me, monsieur, who was she?" Timothy's face darkened, his hand tightening around the glass. "That's none of your business." Helen was paranoid, always imagining slights. "I was her brother-in-law, nothing more." "And yet," Poirot said softly, "she feared you. Why?" Timothy lurched to his feet, his face flushed. "Because she was mad. She thought everyone was after Richard's money. She even accused Maud once, said she was too devoted. Rubbish, all of it." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Devoted, you say? Madame Maud, she is indeed loyal. But to whom, I wonder?" Timothy's mouth opened, then closed. He sank back into his chair, his bravado gone. "Get out," he muttered. "You're barking up the wrong tree, Poirot." Poirot left the room, but not before noting the sweat beading on Timothy's brow. The man was rattled, and rattled men made mistakes as night fell. Poirot returned to his room, the letter from Helen burning in his pocket. He sat at the desk, spreading out his notes, timelines, alibis, motives. Michael's confession, Cora's warning, Helen's fear. They were pieces of a puzzle, but the picture remained elusive. He closed his eyes, letting his mind wander, seeking the thread that would tie it all together. A knock at the door startled him. It was Susan, her face pale in the lamplight. "Monsieur Poirot, I need to speak with you." "It's about Maud." Poirot gestured to a chair. "Sit, mademoiselle. What troubles you?" Susan clasped her hands, her voice low. "I saw her tonight in the garden. She was burning something papers, I think, and she was crying. I've never seen Maud cry." Poirot leaned forward, his interest sharp. burning papers. You are certain? Susan nodded. I couldn't get close enough to see what they were, but she looked desperate. I think she's hiding something, Monsieur Poirot. Something about Richard's death. Poirot's mind raced. Maud, the steadfast wife, destroying evidence. It fit the pattern, her loyalty to Timothy, her unease under scrutiny. But what had she burned? Letters, a confession, or something more damning? Thank you, mademoiselle, Poirot said, rising. You have done well to tell me. Now, return to your room and lock the door. The night, it is not safe. Susan hesitated, then nodded, slipping out as quietly as she'd come. Poirot stood by the window, staring into the darkness. The Hydra's heads were multiplying, but he was close, no so close. Maud was the key, and tomorrow he would confront her as he prepared for bed. Poirot's thoughts returned to Cora's letter. Beware the family's greed. The words echoed in his mind, a warning from beyond the grave. He switched off the lamp, the room plunging into darkness outside. The wind howled, carrying the secrets of Enderby Hall into the night.